Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are coming from. Welcome back for part 3 of the WITA Academy's Intensive Trade Seminar. Special thanks to our WITA Academy sponsors, the American Apparel and Footwear Association, Microsoft, Coupang, and the Christina Bach-Yeiter Charitable Trust. The last 2 days, we discussed how the U.S. government is organized to manage trade policy, investment controls and sanctions, and the key enforcement tools and agencies enforcing U.S. trade laws. Today, we're going to dive into U.S. and global trade policies. Some reminder as you begin today's sessions, your link for the seminar is good for all of today's sessions. So if you get disconnected and need to log back in and log back off and in, the same link will work all day, so it should let you back into the live session. And if for some reason you miss one of the sessions, we're recording it for viewing on a password-protected site, only available to paid and registered attendees, and we expect to have those sessions uploaded as soon as we can after today's sessions are completed. You can ask questions of our discussants using the Q&A tab on Zoom. We encourage you to take advantage of the speakers today and try to get as many of those questions in as you can. You should have all received an email this morning with the agenda and our panelist biographies, so we will not have lengthy introductions before we start each session. As you know, if you've watched any of our regular webinars, we like to call out the names of some of those you're in community with on Zoom, even if you can't see them on camera. And today, shout out to some of our international guests. Javier Gutierrez at the World Trade Organization, Niall Moran, a professor at Dublin City University, Jose Hugo Padilla Guzman, a professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and Sherry Anderson, Senior Trade Policy Officer for the Government of Alberta. Welcome, Javier, Niall, Jose, and Sherry. And a shout out to all the U.S. government officials who are furloughed but watching on their own time. We're grateful for your service to our country and hope the U.S. government shutdown ends soon. And welcome back to all of you. I'd also like to ask our first panel to please turn on their cameras. We've assembled an all-star group to give us an update on where things stand on U.S. trade policy, tariffs, negotiations, and the legal challenges facing the president's IEEPA tariffs. I'd note we're having today's discussion at 9 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time on Tuesday, October 7th. As we say in our events and podcasts these days, what we talk about today may have changed if you're listening or watching the recording of today's discussion at a later date. Welcome to 4 veterans of WITA discussions. Peter Harrell, a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Peter is a former senior director for international economics and competitiveness, the National Security Council, a deputy assistant secretary in the Counter-Threat Finance and Sanctions at the Department of State. Brian Pomper is a partner at Akin and former chief international trade counsel of the U.S. Senate Finance Committee. Stephen Vaughn, a partner at King & Spalding and a former general counsel in the office of the U.S. Trade Representative in President Trump's first term. And our moderator, Nicole Bivens-Collinson, Managing Principal and Operating Committee for the International Trade and Government Relations Practice at Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg. Mouthful introducing all of you and your titles. Welcome and thanks for joining us.
Great. Thanks, Ken. I didn't mean to choke you up like that, but I know it gets so emotional sometimes. So great. Thank you all. As all of you who are listening heard, we have a really great group of folks here. Some are new to me as far as acquaintances and friends, and others are longtime acquaintances and friends that I've known for too many years. We're not going to talk about it. But we're going to take a look sort of at the trade policy and how it's kind of evolved, I would say. I mean, I've been doing this for 40 years now, so it has changed from the way I thought about trade policy and to where we are today. Like I used to always joke, I went to school, I got my master's in international affairs, and I never realized I was going to have to become a geopolitician, looking at geopolitics and how that might impact trade. And then I was going to have to become like a climatologist because I had to know whether or not there was a lot of evaporation and it was causing the lakes and the Panama Canal to dry up. And so the boats were having to come through with, not being so heavily laden and how that was impacting trade and slowing. So all these things started going in. But the other thing that changes it more than that, I think, is what type of administration is going on, or is it sitting in the seats here in Washington, D.C.? As you all know, constitutionally, the authority over the purse strings is resting with Congress. Over the many years, Congress has given certain instances where he gives that authority to the president to be able to take action. You've heard a lot of these. You're familiar with some of them. There's The 1974 Trade Act had lots of little goodies. It has what we call Section 122, which has to deal with tariffs if there's a deficit, basically, trade imbalances. 201, Section 301, you're very familiar with that, came about, really reared its head in the first Trump administration. There's Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which has to do with basically industrial policy and national security. Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. That one has never been used, but it's there, and it's a doozy. It's one that, if it were put in place, could not only put in tariffs, but also ban goods and then allow action on a third country if so desired. So there's lots of instances where Congress, although they have control, they have given that over to the president. They also, in trade negotiations, historically have designed, excuse me, like giving the authority to the president to negotiate specific agreements. For example, they gave trade promotion authority to the president to negotiate the NAFTA originally, for the WTO, for the Colombia, Panama, South Korea, all these different free trade agreements. So Congress has generally given that over, but each president embraces that authority a little bit differently. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how, when each of you have been working either in an administration, or Brian, I mean, you had to work with both, Democrat and Republican administrations, and work on their trade agendas when you were in the Finance Committee. If you could just share with us a little bit about how you felt the president which you served, or time that you served, the policies were being undertaken vis-a-vis trade negotiations and trade policy. So maybe let's start with Brian. You've been around a long time. And you get both sides. You get both sides, then we'll go one-on-one.
Sure. Nicole, I think you were just calling me old there. I think that's what
No.
Well, very nice to be with you all today. Thanks to Ken for the invitation, and I'm really honored to be here with my friends and colleagues here on the panel, who I've known for a long time. Although I will say Stephen and I think, have known each other the longest when I came to Skadden Arps in 1997 as a young associate, just finishing my clerkship, and Stephen was a rising star at Skadden all the way back then. So very good to see you all. So look, I served as the Chief International Trade Counsel in the Senate Finance Committee. I like to say my life is a series of very happy, very lucky accidents. And it just so happened that I was lucky enough to serve on the Finance Committee in that period of competitive liberalization, that very active period of bilateral trade negotiations in the George W. Bush administration that started with Chile and Singapore and really ended with Korea in that period from 2003 to 2007 or so. So how did it work? I mean, the administration, certainly we passed trade promotion authority in 2002. And I always hasten to add that the Constitution very clearly gives to Congress the power to regulate commerce among the foreign nations and to regulate trade and to impose tariffs. I'm sure that will become important later when we talk about the IEEPA tariffs. And so Congress takes that responsibility, or I will say maybe took that responsibility quite seriously back in the day. And when people talk about trade promotion authority, they talk about the process, the ability to negotiate an agreement and get an up or down vote. When I was in the Senate, I thought the other part of trade promotion authority was more important, and that was the setting out the principal negotiating objectives that Congress was laying out for the administration, essentially saying, here is the kind of agreement we want you to negotiate. And I'd say that was sort of the first step in how Congress engaged with the administration in the context of directing these trade negotiations. It is in our constitutional architecture, you can't have 535 members of Congress negotiating agreements with foreign countries. What you have is the president and USTR on behalf of the president negotiating this agreement, but directed by how Congress wanted the administration to go. And I'd say, I think the administrations, they took that direction pretty seriously, more or less. They tried to color within those lines. They were pretty good about keeping, I'd say, the committees, Ways and Means and Finance, up to date on what they were doing and where they were headed. They would post negotiating text confidentially, and we would go review it. We would comment on it. They would meet with us. They would brief us. I served in the minority during the George W. Bush administration, but because I worked for a member who was considered important to the administration's policy in getting these trade agreements passed as one of the I'd say, a leading voice in the Democratic Party in support of these agreements, we did have a lot of engagement with the administration, and they were very good about taking direction. That's not to say they did everything Congress wanted on either side, to be clear. And you should ask the person who was my counterpart most of the time, Everett Eisenstadt, for then Chairman Grassley, whether they listened to everything Chairman Grassley said, and I guarantee you he would say no. But by and large, I mean, it was this cooperative arrangement where we tried to get as much as we could. The administration tried to get away with as much as they could get away with. You used your leverage, which is another word I'm sure we will talk about later, to try to get what you wanted in these agreements. And at the end of the day, you either got what you wanted in the agreements and you supported the implementing legislation, or you didn't. But I'd say it was reasonably cooperative, although clear that it was the administration kind of driving the bus and making most of the proposals, is what I would say. But again, within the confines of what Congress had articulated to the president that they wanted in a trade negotiation.
All right, so that's Congress exerting its position and opinions with the administration. And I felt that, that was going on. I agree. It was going on pretty well up until we got to really the Obama administration. The first one, they did nothing on trade. The second administration, they actually did do some work on trade. And then we got into the Trump administration. And the Trump 1, and then there's Trump 2. So maybe, Stephen, you can talk a little bit about how it was, at least in the first Trump administration.
Yeah, well, I think, one of the things that is important to understand is that, there was a huge shift between the early 2000s and the election in 2016. And the big part of that shift is that we no longer had this very, very solid consensus across both parties in terms of what the trade policy should be. There had been this enormous faith, and hopefulness in terms of what globalization was going to mean. And so there was a view that mainly the goal of policymakers was to sort of lower barriers and let companies kind of go where they wanted to go. I think the election of Trump signaled a change in course. The voters were, we'd already started to see this with the inability to get things like TTIP and TPP over the line. And in fact, I think when Trump was elected in 2016, there hadn't really been a major trade deal that had gotten through Congress since the Korean deal several years before. And there hadn't been any major deals at the WTO in almost 20 years. So globalization was sort of running out of momentum. And so the Trump people were, it was up to them to try to find a way to sort of figure out how do we deliver a system that is going to be more worker friendly, that is going to lead to higher wages, that is going to push back on some of this redistribution of wealth that we saw during the age of globalization. How do we defend our interests against countries like China, who have been very predatory in their behavior? And we had to do that in a context where there was still a lot of folks on the Congress who were still had high hopes for the older system. So I would say the first term was marked by very sort of intense conversations between the Trump people who felt that they really had to do everything they could to try to advance the president's priorities, and a lot of folks on the Hill who continued to fundamentally disagree with a lot of what the president wanted to do. And so I think that it was a situation where we were looking for areas like Section 301 and Section 232 where the president could get some leverage in these negotiations, because the fundamental problem that you have as the White House is that there's really no reason for anybody to negotiate with you unless they feel like you have some way to get them to change policies that they were really happy with. And so over time, we were able to work out enough space, policy space with the Hill, where the president was able to conduct Section 301 investigations into China. He was able to conduct these Section 232 investigations into steel and aluminum without triggering, a real blowback from the Congress. And then with something like the NAFTA, I think the president's initial instinct was probably to just pull out of NAFTA. But that was not something that the Congress was very interested in. So we were, again, able to work out an arrangement whereby we would try to renegotiate the NAFTA in close coordination with the Congress, knowing that eventually the new deal was going to have to come back for a congressional vote. So that was pretty much how things worked in the first term. There was a lot of back and forth between the White House and the Hill. There were a lot of compromises between what the president wanted and what the Hill wanted. And so you started to chart this new path where the U.S. was going to not trust so much in these international institutions, but was going to place more emphasis on what it could get using the leverage of its market, while at the same time not triggering enough of a blowback from the Congress that the president would face insuperable obstacles in carrying out his agenda.
Thanks. Sorry, I couldn't find my cursor. So now let's advance to the next term. And we came into the Biden administration, and we saw yet another type of pivot with respect to trade negotiations / relationships. So Peter, why don't you share with us a little bit what was going on when you were serving in the administration?
I actually want to start by offering some thoughts going back more historically, which I think will then explain, my take looking back on it on the Biden administration. So if I look sort of historically at U.S. trade policy, I think the U.S. trade policy has always been driven by both kind of a set of economic objectives. We want to get more market access from the European Union, or we want to, reduce Canadian subsidies for lumber, economic issues. But it's also very much been driven by geopolitical issues. How do we strengthen NATO or a NATO-like bloc economically for the Cold War? And nowadays, I think you saw this, some of the efforts the Biden administration is doing. How could you think about trade for competition with China? And I think you really, if you look at the history of U.S. trade policy, you have to see it through both this economic lens and also this geopolitical lens. And when I look back at the Biden administration, I think the Biden administration had a geopolitical theory of the case of what it wanted out of trade, but frankly did not have a lot of internal agreement within itself on the economic theory of the case about what it wanted out of trade. So it definitely wanted to think about, things like how can we get our potential allies and partners in the Asia Pacific organized geopolitically to help with competition of China. But because they didn't have an economic theory of the case, which was really due to the fact, as Stephen said, we'd been through this long transition where like our economic views on trade were changing. Because the Biden administration didn't have an economic theory of the case, it wasn't really willing to either offer these Asian countries more market access, remove our remaining already pretty low tariff barriers, nor was it willing, because again, there was a geopolitical logic, nor was it willing to really impose a lot of pressure on these countries to give us economic things we might want as part of a geopolitical deal. And so you frankly saw, some kind of efforts to negotiate agreements without much economic content, but a geopolitical logic in the sense of the IPEF agreement out in Asia, in the sense of this like a US-EU technology and trade council. But again, these were kind of how do we strengthen the geopolitics without a lot of economic content. I do think the one area where the Biden administration had a reasonably clear theory of the case on what they wanted economically was China, where they really were, I think, in some ways continuing what they inherited from the Trump administration. You know, for many years, I think going back to the Clinton era of bringing China into the WTO, there'd been a geopolitical and economic theory of the case on China of, well, if we increase the trade relationship with them, it'll actually get them to behave more responsibly, both economically and politically. You know, there'll be market liberalization. It'll provide opportunities for U.S. firms. And of course, what we saw in practice in the 2000s and 2010s is that that just wasn't happening at all. Instead, China was continuing to subsidize and take advantage of our market access that we had given them in ways that were really adverse to American workers. So the Biden administration, I think, looked at China and thought, well, we're not going to get China to change. Like this idea that trade's going to change who they are just hasn't worked out. On the other hand, they are still a big economy and they're not going anywhere. So you saw the Biden administration adopt much more of what I think of as kind of a managed trade approach to China of we got to see if there are ways we can reduce our dependencies on them and sort of particular areas or products where we don't want to be dependent on them. That's why you saw them in 2024 increase tariffs on a set of discrete products with China. It wasn't really about changing China's behavior. It was about reducing our dependency on China in those particular areas. And then also why you saw all of this sort of effort with export controls on China, again, building on some things the Trump administration had started to sort of say, well, we also don't want China getting access to our leading technology in ways they could use both, you know, sort of militarily, geopolitically, and economically to harm us. And so, you know, I think that was the one area where you saw the Biden administration have a clear vision of we're going to try and manage this trade and de-risk aspects of it. The other, as I say, the other parts of the trade agenda, I think were really through a geopolitical lens, but with a lot of uncertainty about what the economic content of those deals would be.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Suddenly I had to become a geopolitician. I don't know what the word is. Looking at geopolitics, and I was like, this is not what I want to do. So now that brings us to the current Trump administration. And I'm going to again turn first to you, Stephen, to talk about, you know, I mentioned the different powers that are in place. You talked about how in the first Trump administration, we saw 301, we saw some 232s, and now here we are in the first 8 months of the, 9 months, I guess now, 9 months of the presidency, and we've seen a few other little actions. So maybe you can talk about what we're seeing now and what that level of cooperation may or may not be with Congress.
Yeah, so I think that what happened in the second administration is that the president came into Washington in a much stronger political position. Now he had actually won the popular vote. He had won the Republican nomination for the third time. The parts of the country that tend to be where a lot of support in the Hill for free trade tends to come from the rural parts of the country because of the ag interests of the farmers. And yet those are the parts of the country that voted 65, 75, 80% for Trump. And so I think there was an assessment on the Hill that the president had kind of earned much more of a mandate with respect to trade than he had during the first term. Now, I don't think that has translated yet into Congress saying, you know, well, let's work with you on legislation to impose tariffs or change how we do tariffs or things like that. But I do think the Congress has been much more respectful of the president's ability to use the statutory authority he has. You know, these kind of warnings that we kept getting in the first term about, well, the Finance Committee might hold hearings or the Finance Committee might take away some of these powers. Like the president has had to deal with that as much. And so this allowed the president and his team, who had been thinking about what to do for the last 4 years, to be much more aggressive in creating the kind of trading system that the president wants. And that is seen the most obviously in their use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, as we call it here in Washington. And so he was able to act, you know, very aggressively because IEEPA gave him a tool that really allowed him to do things in a much closer, I think, to the way he wanted to do it all along, which is to come in with initial tariff proposals and then calibrate those proposals depending on what he was seeing in terms of market reactions and also what he was seeing in terms of other countries' responses and also what he was seeing in terms of the political effects of those measures. And so you've seen this kind of very iterative process throughout the year where the president makes announcements and then tweaks those announcements in response to the facts on the ground and the proposals that he's getting from other countries. And I think inside the administration, there's a very strong feeling that this has been, extremely effective, that they were able to get a deal with the EU, they were able to get a deal with Japan, they were able to get a deal with Korea. They've been able to get more commitments from companies to invest in the United States. They were able to get their tax cut bill through the Congress. They've been able to get the interest rate cuts that they wanted at the Federal Reserve. I think they're generally happy with where inflation is. I think they're generally happy with where the stock market is. So I think there's a lot of confidence inside the administration that this is going the way they wanted it to go. And I think that, as long as the economic news continues to remain good, I think the president will continue to have a great deal of leverage, both in terms of how he deals with Congress and in terms of how he deals with the rest of the world.
So while we're talking about the IEPAs, we know that right now is before the Supreme Court, and there is a discussion as to whether or not the IEPA actually authorizes the president to use tariffs as one of the tools or ways in which he manages the emergency. Brian, I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about oops. Sorry, alarm went off. If you can talk a little bit about where you see this and how the Supreme Court decision on the tariffs and how that might interplay with Congress, and just give me some of your ideas on where you see that.
Yeah, so I mean, this alone could be the topic of a whole panel, but I won't talk about it. Obviously the lower courts have decided the way the president has used IEPA to impose tariffs has exceeded the scope of his authority delegated by Congress. There are two separate lines of courts. You've got one through the Court of International Trade, basically that said these tariffs. That court effectively, at least implicitly, perhaps explicitly said IEPA does delegate to the president the power to impose tariffs, but these tariffs and the way that he's done them exceed the scope of his authority. And there's a separate line of discussion and argumentation through the DC District Court that said, actually, the IEPA does not delegate any tariff authority to the president at all. The Supreme Court has consolidated those two appeals, actually reached down to the district court level in DC, which is pretty unusual to consolidate it with that Court of International Trade Federal Circuit line of cases. And it's going to hear oral argument, I believe, November 5th. And I think the expectation is that we'll get a decision probably not by the end of the year, but maybe the early part of next year. But of course, the scheduling is entirely up to the Supreme Court. And, I think there are obviously varying views on the strength of the argumentation. I'd say there are strong arguments on both sides, and we'll have to see where the court comes down. I'm happy to tell you what I think, but let me just move on to sort of say that, look, if the court if the court reverses and says, actually, no, not only does IEPA allow tariffs, but the way the president has imposed tariffs here is A-OK, then of course we're in the status quo and the president can continue to do what he does. If the court affirms the decisions, let's just say the court says no tariffs at all, or maybe these tariffs, the way they were imposed, exceed the scope of the authority. And I want to emphasize here, I'm going to talk about it like it's the delegation of authority from Congress to the president, because that's, of course, again, that's our constitutional architecture. And what did Congress intend to delegate? If they decide that it exceeds that scope, I don't know that much will change in the context of either the administration's policy. I think that the administration has tools, and you've mentioned some of them, that can more or less approximate where we are at present. They may be a little less nimble than IEPA. They may, in some circumstances, suffer from their own legal questions But regardless, the president does have tools. I expect the landscape will look relatively similar as it does today, and from a tariff perspective. And I think the foreign countries who have been our counterparties in these negotiations are well aware of that. And so I think they probably will want to keep their agreements in place the way that they are, and for no other reason than, they know the president has the authority and the willingness to approximate where we are at present, but also they may like the certainty that they get, both from having a clear tariff rate on a reciprocal basis, but also for those countries who have gotten relief from the 232s, they probably like that relief. One question for me is what does the president, the money that's being raised by these tariffs, that to me seems the biggest outcome if the court overturns these tariffs, is all that money and how it will be refunded, and much of it, I believe, will have to be refunded. And that, to me, strikes me as a very complicated process. So I'll stop there.
Well,
one more thing, if I could.
Okay.
Look, the court could also split the baby, right? It could say that, some of the tariffs are okay, so maybe the Brazil, India, China, Mexico, Canada tariffs, those IEEPA tariffs are okay, but the reciprocal tariffs are too much, and that'll bring its own set of questions. But again, bottom line, the president has the authority to basically approximate where we are at present, and I don't know that the trade landscape is going to change all that much.
Yeah, I would just say with respect to refunding of the tariffs, it's very simple. CBP collects the money, CBP refunds the money. They do it every day for, overpayment. They did it for GSP in the times that it expired, and it was just automatically renewed. Everybody got their checks. They have now gone to electronic funds transfer. There was just a big notice earlier this week, or I guess it was end of last week, talking about here's the new process. So they're not even having to cut checks and mail them anymore. So I think the fig leaf of this is going to be really hard and we can't give it back is just a fig leaf. But Peter, I'd be interested. I know that you've talked a lot about the IEEPA and the tariffs, and I'd be very interested in what do you think if, Brian has said he thinks that the countries will go ahead and hold on to those agreements. Just kind of curious how you think the interplay between the court case and the negotiations that are going on right now, and how that might play out.
And absolutely. And first, let me just unpack for a minute, building on what I thought was Brian's really thoughtful overview of what the legal issue here is. So IEEPA was passed in 1977 as kind of an emergency powers statute for dealing with crises in international affairs. And then prior to President Trump's second term, mostly been used for things like sanctions and export controls and whatnot. And the statute doesn't anywhere in it have the word tariff or excise or duty. The government's argument is IEEPA does allow the president to regulate, quote unquote, the importation or exportation of property. And so the government's argument is basically, well, regulate here means include, among other things, the power to, make subject to a duty. And the plaintiffs in the various cases against this basically say, no, regulate might mean a time, place, or manner type restriction, but doesn't mean include an authority to impose taxes. And there are a couple of other arguments at issue, but that's the core argument. At issue that I think the Supreme Court is going to decide this case on. Now, that said, I agree very much with Brian that well, if the Supreme Court strikes down these tariffs, they're going to be interesting questions about refunds. And does, Nicole, as you suggest, the government make it easy to get a refund, or does the government choose to make it difficult to get a refund? I think that they certainly could make it easy. Whether they will make it easy, I think, is a different, entirely different question. So, there'll be questions about refunds, and then there will be complicated questions about exactly how the president tries to recreate these tariffs under other authorities. I agree with Brian. He can probably recreate a good share of them under other authorities. It'll be complicated, and they won't be as quick to impose, but he can recreate a good number. And in part because he can recreate a good number, I actually think from the perspective of finalizing these trade frameworks that have been announced and concluding other trade frameworks, I actually don't think the Supreme Court, a loss at the Supreme Court would be all that impactful on these trade deals. Because as Brian says, First of all, if you are, a Germany or European Union or a Japan, you don't just care about the IEEPA tariffs. You also care about like the 232 tariffs, which are the tariffs on your car exports, which really matter to you if you're the European Union or Japan. And, one of the things you got as part of these trade deals was a reduction in car tariffs from 27.5% to 15%. So I think you basically stick to the deal both because you want to continue to get this relief on the non-IEEPA tariffs, and also because Trump will be able to recreate some of I think of at least half of the tariffs under other authorities. Now, that's not to say like countries will do everything exactly the same. I could see countries kind of going a little slow on some of the commitments they've made that are harder to implement, to sort of, buy some time while Trump recreates the tariffs under other authorities. So it's possible to me you might see a little bit of a slowdown of implementation of some of these deals, but I don't think anybody walks away. And I think ultimately they stick by the broad parameters of the deals, even if they maybe try to, slow down a little bit on some of the politically harder things that they've committed to doing.
Oh, that's interesting. Stephen, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this topic that you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, I mean, I think Brian and Peter are largely right. I mean, look, I think it's safe to say that the EU and Japan and these other countries had access to really, really good trade counsel when they were having their negotiations with the White House. And I think, they made it would have been very easy for them to say, we're not going to negotiate until we see what happens at the court. And we think the IEEPA decision is going to make a big difference. And I think they were smart to recognize that the president will still have a lot of leverage, whatever happens with IEEPA. And I think they were smart to go ahead and cut their deals. And I think, as Brian points out, I think they're going to want to preserve those deals. I think the administration will want to preserve the deals as well. So, I agree with all of those points. I do think, I guess I would just make two other observations. One, I think, that it is a close case, and I think there are definitely people inside the administration who think that they have a very good case and that they will win. And obviously, if they do that, then as Brian points out, we just kind of keep doing what we've been doing. The other thing, I think, if the president does not have this full authority under IEEPA, I do think we'll have a much more robust conversation about, does the president need more authority? Should he go back to the Congress? And what would that look like if that's something that he chooses to do? But I think in terms of sort of the deals and the things that have been worked out already, I agree with Brian and Peter. I think those are going to stay in place.
And so it's interesting. I've heard the term framework, I've heard the term deal, I've heard the term arrangement, but I haven't really heard the term agreement. And is there, are we saying that what was happening right now is not in the same context of these agreements, which the Congress has historically had to have a say over, they've had to approve in some manner or fashion. And so is this a nuance of the way they're doing it? Or, how do you think that this new style of negotiating, these arrangements, these frameworks, these whatevers, how does that interplay with respect to the Congress? Will they have to approve it? Should they have to approve it? Should they give guidance? Just interested in maybe what your thoughts are there. And I will see which of you would like to take that first.
Well, I'll go first, but and I will say that I think anybody who thinks the Congress isn't going to have their say in any of this is naive. I mean, the Congress is definitely going to have a say. They talk to the administration all the time. Anytime you're in the administration, there's enormous pressure from the Congress to respond to congressional concerns and congressional initiatives. And so I think that, I think whether or not it actually goes to Congress for a vote, I don't think Congress always likes to vote on things. I think there's a lot of situations where Congress would prefer to just simply confer with the president. And as long as the president is acting along the lines with the way Congress wants it to do, I think Congress is just as happy not to actually, have a voice vote or a record vote and go on the situation. So I think that I just don't think any president is really going to be able to maintain a trade policy in opposition to real frustration and opposition from the Congress. I just don't think that's ever going to be sustainable. And so I think at a minimum, you have to have a policy that the Congress is like, we're willing to give this a chance. And I think that's basically where they've worked things out between the president and the Congress, at least for now. And my guess is that for a while now, I think most people are going to conclude that the way we've been doing things this year is more effective and certainly more efficient than going through the entire TPA process. And I think you're going to see more of these type of arrangements as opposed to the old, formal TPA type deals.
Anybody else have any thoughts on that?
I'll add a couple of points. So first, it was interesting for me to hear Stephen comment that if the president loses at the Supreme Court, I think there's going to be, that he thinks there might be some robust discussion about going to Congress for more authorities, because that has also been my view. I mean, I think Congress, as Stephen says, Congress actually in many ways doesn't want to have to vote on these trade policies, because on the one hand, they like being able to say both, well, we appreciate like the additional market access Trump has won, but also we don't want to have to, vote on something that could be portrayed as hiking taxes on, whatever kind of import, that our constituents care about. So I actually think Congress, and so I agree with Stephen in some ways, Congress likes the current outcome. That said, if the president does suffer a loss, well, he has other authorities. I think there will be some robust discussion about, should Congress enact something on the authority? Should Congress, at least ratify the parameters of a couple of these deals? So I think things could get more interesting in Congress. I also think that over the mid to longer term, especially if Congress changes whether or not the president wins this particular court case, I think that if Congress changes partisan control, you are probably going to see some fighting there on authorities and responsibilities kinds of issues. So I do think that, as Stephen says, at the end of the day, Congress is going to continue to have a role on this. Congress is potentially going to want to be exercising its authorities and its role more robustly going forward. And I don't think trade is going to just be sort of forever an executive branch issue. That said, I also want to pick up on something Stephen said. One of the things that has made trade negotiations so complicated in the past, and I look back to the Obama administration trying to negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I think part of their challenge there was just like the kind of gas had run out of the car on these market liberalizing agreements. I think that was one of their challenges. But I think another part of their challenge is when you go to Congress to get negotiating parameters up front, Congress gives you this kind of impossibly long wish list of negotiating things you should try to pursue that just in the real world is very, very hard to achieve all of them. And I think in a way, one thing that Trump has been able to do with these deals, in addition to, being able to very substantially increase tariff rates to generate on short order a lot of leverage, he also has been able to decide kind of on a relatively smaller number of things he actually wants out of these deals. And that has given him, because he hasn't had this, 30-page wish list from Congress that he's got to deal with. And I think that has actually put him in a stronger negotiating position. And I think there might be some interesting lessons for the future, even if and as Congress plays a larger role again on trade policy.
Nicole, just like a couple thoughts. I agree. If there were to be a loss at the Supreme Court, there would be congressional interest in doing something. There has been some discussion on the Hill about legislating a 10% baseline tariff across the board. I think that would have some difficulty passing, but nevertheless, there is discussion along those lines. But I'll say this: I think even This will be an understatement. I think there has been a lot of concern in the Democratic Party of President Trump exceeding the bounds of historical authorities here. But I would say in the context of trade policy, those sorts of concerns, I think, also exist among some in kind of the more traditional, kind of what I think of as more traditional, kind of pro-trade globalist type Republican in Congress. I think there was discussion, perhaps quiet discussion, during the Biden administration among some Republicans about the desire to rein in some of the authorities that Congress has delegated to the president over the years, precisely because of a concern that they're too broad, they're too vague, there's no time limitations. There's I think a sense that there's not as much congressional control over trade policy as I think President Trump's first term, and certainly now the second term, has laid bare. So I think that is definitely a conversation, perhaps in some future administration, maybe if there's a change in Congress, this idea about changing the balance of power and control between Congress and the administration. Because again, my experience had been that it really was this quite cooperative enterprise. Stephen is no doubt correct that and we talked about this before, that Congress is beating USTR and Commerce every day to do this or do that. But at the end of the day, the president really does have the authority, and Congress doesn't have much control. And these tariffs there's no time limit. There's very little that Congress can do about them in any real sense. And I think that is definitely something I think a future Congress is at a minimum going to think pretty hard about.
So there may be some changes to the authorities, but in one sense, I think I'm hearing Stephen saying that it would be changes to the authority to allow the president to be able to take more action in the direction that he wants to go. And I think, Brian, what I'm hearing from you is there might be changes to the authority to try to put more guardrails up on the whatever actions that the president might take. So I think, who knows? And of course, the wind may blow depending on who has the majority, right?
Well, I should clarify, I certainly do not think if the president loses the IEPA case, right, I do not think that he's going to get that same type of authority again. Okay. I mean, anytime you go to the Congress and you sort of negotiate with them for anything, right, you're going to have to give some things up in order to get some things. But I certainly agree with Peter. I think that the TPA process has become very clogged and difficult and unwieldy. And people forget TPA was originally designed to encourage deals and to make it easier to do deals with the United States. And over time, TPA really became something that made it very, very difficult to negotiate with the United States. And it was significant, I think, that even in the Obama administration, they decided that the smartest thing to do with something like TPP was to just negotiate it outside the TPA process and only then come back and try to work it through Congress. So I don't think the president will have the same amount of authority if he loses IEPA as he does now. But I do think until we have a new consensus on what to do about trade, I think all parties are going to sort of show more flexibility than we had a few years ago.
No, I think that's interesting. And one of the next, in addition to these bilateral negotiations that are happening with the various countries under the auspices of the IEPA tariffs, we also have the review of the USMCA. And I understand that, later today, there's going to be a panel really diving into that. But I would just kind of like for us to touch on it and get some ideas of how you think going into, because we saw in the first Trump administration, right, a renegotiation of the NAFTA become the USMCA. And now we're in a position where we're at the 6-year review. And the question is this a renegotiation? Is it just a review? Is it going to be a rehashing of old wounds that weren't, picking off the scabs because they may have healed over, but they're still bothersome? Or is it going to be really trying to move forward with addressing some of the newer things in trade. I mean, I had always envisioned that having this 6-year review, I thought was a great thing because time, otherwise we have a still picture, right? We have a picture in time. We don't have a movie, and things evolve, things change. There's, new kinds of trade, there's new products, there's AI, there's all these different things that may evolve. And so I would be interested in what your all's take is on how this review will move forward, if it's a renegotiation, if it's going to be really trying to address the new things, or if it's going to be just a bunch of picking scabs. Let's see, Peter.
So, first of all, I want to agree, Nicole, with something you said, which I think that the fact that the first Trump administration, Stephen, maybe it was your idea, was pushed very hard for a time limit to USMCA and a review process, but frankly, a very long time limit that provided business some stability, I think is a very important innovation, and I think should be copied into future trade agreements, because the practical reality is, unless you have a review process and some kind of sunset, if one party gets unhappy with the trade agreement, but the other parties are happy, like there's not really any pressure on the happy parties to renegotiate, and actually just pulling out is very, very hard of these things. So I actually think this was a very good innovation on the part of the first Trump administration, and something I think is useful to carry forward. Again, realizing these review processes and timelines need to be long enough that an agreement will provide stability for companies that are making complicated cross-border investment decisions and cross-border commercial decisions. In terms of the review itself, and I'd love to hear Stephen and Brian's views. I mean, it seems to me that you hear James, the administration may be deciding between a couple of different models that it wants to pursue with this renegotiation. So, I hear USTR Jamison Greer, he'll sometimes talk about this idea of a fortress North America, which I take as an idea that we would continue to maintain relatively low barriers within North America, but in exchange, we'd like to see Mexico and Canada raise some additional barriers of their own, particularly to China. And we're actually seeing the Mexicans begin to do this in a couple of areas just over the last couple of months. So it's kind of an idea that we would continue to have a pretty integrated North American base, but with maybe some higher collective walls externally. And that to me strikes me as one model that is clearly under consideration from the U.S. perspective for this renegotiation. There are obviously a number of bilateral, you might call them irritants or challenges, that also I think there's a lot of interest in seeing worked out through this renegotiation, whether it's the Canadian dairy issues that the president keeps bringing up, or lumber issues, or ongoing Mexico issues, and vegetable issues. There are definitely some bilateral issues here to be worked out, but I also think there's just this really interesting strategic concept the administration is thinking about of kind of fortress North America.
Yeah, I don't want to claim credit for the time limit. That was Ambassador Lighthizer idea, but I thought it was a good idea, and I think it is a useful idea now. Nicole, in terms of what I think is going to happen, I think Peter's, I think it's going to be a very challenging negotiation. I think that, it's important for everybody to understand the president's always been skeptical of these type of deals. They're more popular I think they're generally more popular on the Hill than they are in the White House these days. And I don't think it's going to be that easy to convince the president that the deal has been adjusted in a way that he thinks is really in the full interest of the United States. I certainly think that Peter has correctly heard, Jameson's message, which is that if Mexico and Canada want to maintain these type of relations with the United States, they are probably going to have to show a willingness to take policies so that Mexico and Canada cannot be used as platforms for China to attack the U.S. market. I don't think the Americans are ever going to give Canada and Mexico that type of an opportunity. And so I expect a fairly robust negotiation, Nicole. I don't think it's just going to be little tweaks and drabs here and there. I think it's going to be pretty comprehensive in terms of the asks that are coming from Mexico and Canada.
Yeah, let me just really quickly add in here. I agree entirely. I think it is much more of a renegotiation than a review. I think just a couple of quick points. Of course, we do have these separate bilateral negotiations that are ongoing, both U.S. Canada and U.S. Mexico. Actually, I think a lot of the issues that might have normally been addressed in the context of this review might be addressed bilaterally in advance of the review. But I do think USMCA remains quite important for the U.S. business community. The kind of the connective tissue that has been built up over years in these cross-border supply chains, I think is quite important. So there will be a lot of interest in maintaining USMCA. My understanding is the president it has, in some respects, kind of soured on really what was his project, USMCA, because I think was hoping or had thought that it would reduce the trade deficit with Mexico in particular. And in fact, I believe the trade deficit has gotten worse in the period since USMCA passed. And I think that has made a big impression on him. And part of the reason why it may be difficult to convince him. And lastly, just on Mexico in the context of USMCA, I actually think that the administration had been considering using USMCA a little bit as like a platform or like a test case for changing how the rule of origin works in the United States, in the sense of moving away from what I think is a fairly common rule of substantial transformation out of a concern that it hides Chinese content. And that really where USMCA is I think likely to go is this idea that you need to understand what kind of percentage of Chinese content exists in the products that you are injecting into the US supply chain, and that perhaps some percentage, throwing it out, 30%, let's say, is too much Chinese content in order to be considered a product that would be afforded USMCA provisions. So that I think is something that will certainly at a minimum be discussed.
Yeah, I think, I work with a lot of folks in the private sector, and business hates uncertainty. And it has been nothing but uncertain for many months. And I know that companies, I feel sometimes I hear the calls all the time about how this has stopped. They were going to invest, and they thought the idea was to get out of China and to come and, start investing here, but then they have to export the machinery, and they've got tariffed on the machinery. So now they're not going to do their expansion plans, or they're not going to do the new investment plan. So I just feel like everyone's almost frozen in their tracks until I don't know what time and point in the future. But we definitely see that there's ongoing negotiations. We definitely see that by drips and drabs, we learn little bits about the different agreements. I mean, the EU, we've got some information, but there's still ongoing talks on steel and aluminum. And so, I think in this environment, it is difficult not only, looking at the other countries and how they're trying to figure out their relationship with the United States. I think companies are trying to figure out what is their relationship with the United States. And unfortunately, I think that sometimes because of the uncertainty and the constant changing, some of them are just electing, what, I'm just going to stay put. I'm going to stay where I am. And many times that's China. And I'll deal with these tariffs. And then when the dust settles, then maybe I'll try to figure out where to go. So I think we got a lot on our plates coming up in the near future. And I definitely want to thank all of you, each of you, for your input, your opinions. I know that you've got experience. It's good to hear some of the experience. And I think it's going to be exciting, if nothing else, for the next couple years. And I am very interested, of course, as a trade nerd, to continue to see where we might end up, even by the end of this week, by Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock. It's like, I'm going to please get through the weekend so I can go home or go play tennis or something. But it's always exciting, if that's the appropriate word. But thank you so much for your time, your knowledge, wisdom, talents, and sharing your treasures of everything you've done with us.
Thank you, Nicole, Peter, Stephen, Brian. Really appreciate you guys joining us today. and sharing what you know and providing important context for our guests. So thank you for joining us. I'd like to ask panel 2 to please turn on their cameras. As a reminder, we are having this discussion at 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time on Tuesday, October 7th. What we talk about today may change if you're listening or watching a recording of today's session at a later date. What's happening with U.S. trade policy isn't happening in a vacuum. About 85% of the world purchasing power resides outside the United States, and what the U.S. does has impacts beyond its markets. To help us understand the global context and how the direction of U.S. policy is impacting global trade relationships, we have a fantastic panel assembled coming to us from all over the world today. But I'd like to start with welcoming Angela Ellert, who's the former Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. Angela has taken part, I believe, in every intensive trade seminar we've run for more than 20 years. First as Chief Trade Counsel of the House Ways and Means Committee, and then in her role as Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. Angela, it's a pleasure to have you back on, I believe now back in Washington, D.C. Deborah Elms is the Head of Trade Policy at the Hinrich Foundation and a former founder and executive director of the Asia Trade Center, and I believe she's coming to us from Singapore. Chris Horseman is a deputy editor at Borderlex, whose work focuses on the EU, UK, global trade and agriculture trade policy issues. I believe he's in the UK right now. Yes, I got that right. Laurie Lizaire is president and CEO of the Corporate Council on Africa. She's a former assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Africa. And our moderator, my good friend Kelly Myman-Hawk, who's a senior counselor at McLarty Associates. She's a former director of Brazil in the Southern Cone at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. Thank you all for joining us.
Great. Thanks, Ken, and thanks to our panelists and for all of you around the world for being with us here today. I've really been looking forward to this conversation because obviously we've got a lot going on here in the United States, but there's a lot going on outside of the United States, and we tend to not spend enough time in Washington thinking about that. So greatly oversimplifying it, I tend to think about this in 3 buckets. Bucket number 1 is how are our trading partners responding to U.S. actions? Retaliation, not retaliation, engaging, not engaging. Bucket number 2, how are they engaging with each other in order to de-risk away from the United States? And this is a really, really interesting topic that we've seen evolved, Ken, since the panel that we did with WITA back in February at the beginning of the year. And then lastly, what are countries doing with respect to China? Because obviously the core issue of hypersubsidization and overcapacity hasn't gone away because of what we're doing here in the United States, and all of that production has to go somewhere. So you're seeing, Peter raised in the last panel, the fact that the Mexicans have recently endeavored to increase tariffs on China and other trading partners. We've got, the quality control orders that India has put into place, mandating inspections of factories. I was told by Rick Rosso, who handles India at McLarty, that they announced that when India had not one inspector located in China. So go figure. So everyone's kind of looking at that China bucket. How do we manage that overcapacity in interesting ways? And then finally, and Angela, I'm looking at you with this one, multilateralism. What does this mean for the global trading system? So with that, Deb, I'd like to start with you as you sit in Singapore. I think no one has written about, thought about, talked about what Southeast Asia is doing in this space. And, Southeast Asia is really sandwiched between China and the US in a very unique way. What do you see going on right now? Where are countries kind of putting their chits in order to be able to grapple with this situation?
Well, that's a tough one. It's a very diverse region. And so we have different opinions across the area. But I would say, just even listening to the last hour, that it's so striking to me how different the conversations are in Washington and the conversations in Asia, completely different. All Asian conversations are always about, yeah, this totally sucks. The US has gone crazy. We don't know what we're going to do. We're going to pivot and do something else. But in the meantime, let's look for opportunities. Let's look for bright spots. Where is the growth happening? And so that sort of perpetual optimism from Asia is really striking, especially compared to other conversations. And the reason that they're so optimistic is because, well, first of all, it's a trade dependent region, right? So if you are export led and trade dependent, then you need to keep trade lanes open, point one. And that means that if you need to do something with the Trump administration to keep them from being even more difficult, then you try to do so. But your leverage is limited, including across some of the larger countries in the region. Leverage is still relatively limited. See what kind of short-term deal you might be able to cut with the Trump administration. If you write it on a napkin, whatever, as long as it doesn't get worse, that's great. So try to pacify the Trump administration, but even that's getting difficult. And I'm sure we'll come back to this, but with Trump supposed to be in this region in a week and a half and plans changing literally by the minute and new conditions getting added to the agendas of both ASEAN and APEC, nobody's happy. So like we have got deep unhappiness anyways and growing unhappiness. But that brings me to the sort of second point that I just want to make quickly, which is, however, all is not lost in Asia because this is a very trade dependent region and they have a ton of different ways in which to engage. And so ASEAN is continuing with its own economic integration. The CPTPP, which I realize in Washington is viewed as a dead animal, is not only alive, but it's kicking and it's expanding with the announcement we're about to get on the newest 13th member with Costa Rica this year, and a long line of countries that want to join, including ones you wouldn't imagine, like Cambodia is now keen to join CPTPP. So like, that's interesting. The CPTPP countries want to coordinate better with Europe. So some sort of EU CPTPP coordination, something CPTPP in ASEAN, like that level of conversation is continuing. We have upgrades of lots of different agreements. One big one that will be announced shortly is with ASEAN and China, the third round of the upgrade between those two regions. And we've got the European Union extremely active in Asia, just signed an agreement with Indonesia. Indonesia just signed with Canada. So we have a lot of bilateral FTAs. And then the last thing that I think is interesting is new innovative ways to address trade with one another, including a digital trade, green trade, and a new, which I'll talk about a bit later, I'm sure, this FITP, the Future of Investment and Trade Partnership, which is small countries trying to figure out where do we go from here as small countries. And it all is testament to the fact that trade still matters, cooperation still matters, integration matters. This is a region that has not turned its back on like genuine trade agreements, not a napkin deal. But they're also flexible. So they're prepared to do like whatever it takes to keep things moving and keep people with economic growth in the future.
No, thanks for that, Deb. One agreement that you didn't mention was RCEP. I'm wondering if you could comment just a bit, just given that China does participate in that one. How is that playing in, if at all?
Yeah, sorry, I meant to mention RCEP as well. I mean, I know from Washington, the view is that the only two countries that really matter is the US and China, and clearly sitting in Asia, both are important. But I would say actually the view is much more nuanced in Asia because China is the largest trade partner and has been for a long time for everybody in the region. And you have to deal with China. So that situation of sort of tension is there, but it is less obvious, especially in the economic sphere. And Asia is very good at compartmentalizing. That's politics, that's security, this is economics. We can have an engagement in economics, even if we don't like each other in security or politics or the reverse. So that I think is important. And where that comes up especially is in the RCEP negotiations. So RCEP, 15 countries here in Asia, China, Japan, Korea, all 10 members of ASEAN, Australia, and New Zealand, 15 markets, with a bunch in line to join, including, again, some unusual ones, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, very keen to get into RCEP, because this is, again, where the growth is happening. So we have seen muted response to RCEP when it came into force. It came into force just ahead of COVID, and so COVID, you can imagine, was kind of a mess. But there is a renewed push now to have RCEP become much more meaningful. And that's being driven in a lot of different ways, including by China, which they were not doing earlier. Earlier, it was very ASEAN driven. Now it's a bit more China driven. The idea, again, is how can we leverage this opportunity to become more integrated, to have alignment, to create an Asian platform for Asia, which we haven't really had. We've had Asian platform, of course, supply chains matter, but the final output has gone largely to the US or Europe or Japan, perhaps. What about doing it in Asia for Asia? And I think this is an interesting pivot point for RCEP as well. We're about to have a summit for RCEP also in 2 weeks. And there will be, I think, a few announcements coming out of RCEP that might catch people a bit by surprise about, again, it's the fact it exists, that it's expanding, that there's a process in place now for handling accessions, a bit more work on a secretariat, et cetera. So I think it's one to watch.
Thanks for that, Debbie. Folks tend to forget about it. Chris, I'm going to, at least here in Washington, not where you sit, obviously. Chris, I'm going to pivot to you. Obviously, Europe has had a very ambitious trade agenda ex-US, and not even just the EU, but EFTA. Just completed an agreement with my beloved Mercosur. So it's happening kind of across the board. I'm wondering if you could just open up, giving us an optic on where Europe, and again, big piece of real estate, but where they're really focusing on their efforts on, and also how they're addressing the China question.
Sure, Kelly, thanks very much for having me join you today. So the EU is one of the three big trade superpowers, along with China and the US. So while it is very heavily affected by what's going on in the US, it also kind of has to give the impression that it's kind of making its own weather with regards to international trade. It's a difficult balancing act, really. But there's no doubt that its trade negotiating agenda has been given a boost by Donald Trump. The EU kind of lost its appetite for trade deals a little bit in the early part of this decade. It had Brexit to sort out with the UK, then there was COVID, then there was the Ukraine war. The European Parliament started to fragment, more members from fringe parties who were sort of antipathetic to free trade. But now the EU sees a need to grow its trade relationship, and I think that's for several reasons. One is economic growth. Trump's tariffs are not positive for the economic growth of any other country, whether or not it helps the US. So if trade is going to boost the economy of Europe, then it has to find that growth elsewhere. Secondly, there's a political reasoning, geopolitical reasoning. If other countries, especially developing countries, can't do business freely with the US and they can't come to Europe, then they'll turn to China. And that's not something which thrills people in Brussels particularly. And thirdly, there's a desire to send this political message that free international trade rules still matter. The WTO is kind of stuck, but free trade agreements are an option for expanding rules-based trade, and the EU is starting to move back in that direction. The EU decided not to retaliate against the tariffs that Trump imposed. It did its own napkin trade deal, to use Deborah's phrase. It's a work in progress. The EU insists on this, not least because that way it has the appearance of WTO compliance, or at least it can say it's WTO compliant without putting its tongue too far in its cheek. So that's going on, and that has given EU exporters relief from some of the worst impacts of the tariffs. But as you mentioned, Kelly, the big thing that's happened this year is that this year's chaos has finally given the EU the courage to put its Mercosur trade deal to the Council and Parliament, and that's ongoing this fall, I should say. I'm just got to use the right terminology for my audience. That was concluded almost 6 years ago now, but only now has the EU decided it's time to go ahead. It will be a big challenge. European farmers are very unhappy about the possible prospects of that agreement. Some farm-based member states will probably vote against it in the Council of Ministers, the likes of France, Ireland, maybe Spain, Austria. But the calculation in Brussels has now shifted. We need this deal. This deal needs to happen. It's going to be transformational for us, for the economy overall. Likewise, Mexico, there's an EU-Mexico deal which has been sitting around in limbo for several years. It was renegotiated. That was concluded 3 days before Trump's inauguration this January, and both of those deals are now before the Council and the European Parliament, and they're being pushed through. Deborah mentioned the EU's just done a deal with Indonesia. That was announced last week, a sort of traditional comprehensive free trade agreement. The EU's also been very active on digital trade. There was a new deal with South Korea, which was signed recently. And the EU is making overtures to CPTPP. Again, as Deborah mentioned this, it could get more of a political boost after the CPTPP ministerial, which is happening in Australia next month. As far as China is concerned, I think the EU is taking a line of cautious engagement. It knows that it needs China as an import partner and as an export partner. And so the trade has to continue. Brussels is critical of Chinese industrial policy, just as the US is. It is pushing very hard for talks at WTO level on industrial subsidies and its impact on overcapacity. Those talks may or may not materialize. But the Commission is protecting itself against China primarily through sort of anti-dumping and countervailing duties initiatives. The Commission's latest report said that it's carried out monitoring on 15 investigations last year, 12 of them related to China. So, China is very much at the focus of that. It put tariffs on electric vehicles and batteries for electric vehicles last year, which was a big step towards protecting what is perceived to be a vulnerable part of the European economy. And just this afternoon, the European Commission is going to announce a replacement policy on steel to replace the WTO safeguards, which are going to expire in the middle of next year. And there will be a big tightening up of the quotas for Chinese steel imports, as indeed they are for every other supplier country. But it doesn't have, the EU doesn't have the same ambition as the US appears to have to sort of disconnect from China completely. I was just listening to a WTO press conference where they said there'd been a 19% drop in bilateral US-Chinese trade in the first half of this year. That's a big adjustment. There won't be anything like that in the EU. Trade will continue. They're very wary of each other. There's plenty of action going on in the WTO dispute settlement body, which continues to operate even though the appellate body is no longer functional. But it is a measured relationship, and it is continuing.
Great, thank you so much. Flory, off to you. I know as a Latin America guy, I get frustrated that folks in town don't always realize how much ground we've lost in recent decades to China and Latin America. And I feel like that dynamic is almost on steroids in Africa. I'm wondering if you could paint us a picture with respect to the current state of play. And again, it's an enormous, continent. So I know it's very different from country to country, but just generally, how you see that. And obviously, this is all upon the backdrop of AGOA's expiration. Just would love your just to start off with some general comments on the picture on the continent, and where is Africa looking for friends and allies and trading partners?
So thanks, Kelly. It's a great question, and thanks to WITA for having me be a part of this panel and having the Africa perspective. So I think that on the one hand, it's good for us to keep our eyes on the fact that Africa trades so much more, many times over with China, what they trade with the US. We've lost, much ground on the continent in terms of trade overall. But I think there are some other things that are perspectives. It's why I was just at a meeting with African ambassadors in Washington yesterday, and why AGOA and why trade with the US is still so important, despite the fact that it's small, is the fact that they send more manufactured products to the US than they do to China. So the composition of the trade that Africa has with the US versus the composition of their trade with China is important. So just as an example, we are Africa's top market for apparel. We are their number 3 market for autos and auto parts. And if you look at apparel, of their top 5 markets, China's not even in it. And you get countries like Kenya. CCA just hosted President Ruto in New York during UNGA, and he was talking about the fact that they had maybe about 500 million in exports of apparel alone to the US last year that supports 60,000 jobs in Kenya. So just in that one sector, their exports, they're the largest apparel exporter to the US under AGOA. So again, I think it's the composition of the trade, it's the creation of jobs, which is so important for Africans. And the thing that we hear all the time when we go to Africa is they also like the way that US companies trade and invest in Africa. They transfer skills. They hire local people as opposed to kind of what they tend to see with other companies and not just China. We're competing with the rest of the world in Africa. And so the conversation that it's just about the US and China is totally off track. So our investments in value-added manufacturing in Africa is critical. And there has been a shift over the years, and especially during COVID, of more manufacturing in Africa closer to where the products are. We're even seeing some shifts in critical minerals. And so, AGOA makes a difference if we can invest, the US can invest in key sectors that are important for us so that there's more supply chain resiliency. We don't want to be so dependent on China, and others, but specifically China. And if we can do more investment in lithium processing and things that are related to manufacturing batteries and so forth that we need, right? And the Trump administration has made it clear that we want to have more independence of our own, less reliance on the global market generally. Well, China is already running that market, in terms of lithium and cobalt and all of that, in terms of the value addition. But a lot of it comes from Africa. So there is a reason for US companies to invest in beneficiation of those products in Africa so that we, the US, will partner with Africa and not be so dependent on China. So, we have to look at some of the geopolitical, some of the supply chain dynamics of why our trade with Africa, even though it is small, Africa's trade with us is less than of 1% of our total trade. So, if you put it in the big context, but when you then look at certain specific supply chains, you can tell why it's so important. And then you can also tell why, despite their large trade, the overall amount with China, China's not in their top 5 exports of autos, not in their top 5 exports of apparel. And you can go through a number of these, light manufacturing. So we've got to put all of that in context. But I just want to touch on AGOA for a minute. Its expiration, and you look at the reciprocal tariffs, to talk about that for a minute. Most of the sub-Saharan African countries ended up at either 10% or 15%. Well, that 10 or 15 was on top of 0 when AGOA was still in place. And now you have average tariffs on some of their most important exports to us that may be 17% or 27%. And when you add the 10 or 15 on top of that, then they can't compete then. And so we're going to have to look at what will happen. We are all hoping, a whole bunch of us that have been working on this are hoping that there will be a bill. Maybe it'll be language in a CR that happens in November or December, that will add maybe 1 year. That's what we're being told, 1 year of AGOA renewal, while the administration and the Hill look at aligning AGOA and other preference programs like Haiti Hope. We've been talking to the Haiti Hope people, align what they're going to do to make it more amenable to the America First trade policy. And the Africans are open to that. They're looking at AGOA and beyond AGOA. And many of them have told us that they're ready to go beyond AGOA, but they need AGOA for now to be extended. We really need a 10-year extension of AGOA, but they're not averse to looking at what needs to happen to create more mutual benefits. And the last thing I'll say is there has been mutual benefits for the United States. We have about 450,000 jobs in the US that are attached to AGOA trade, either the imports or the exports. And by the way, we have gained more in our exports to Africa over the 25 years of AGOA than the Africans have increased their trade to us in that period. And of the 34 countries that are AGOA eligible, 22 of them have trade deficits with the United States rather than trade surpluses. So, there's this big picture. And, I just think that we need to keep in mind that it is important for a variety of reasons. And if we don't want to push the Africans closer to China, and if we want to make sure that the US is protecting key value chains, then Africa really is the answer. And we need to make sure that we look at how we can work and partner with the Africans to increase our trade and our investment with them. And the other thing I'll mention is that DFC, the authorization for DFC ended on October 5th on Sunday. So we have a double whammy because DFC has been investing in for US companies that are doing various projects on the continent. And so the end of AGOA on September 13th, and then the lack of authorization for DFC on October 5th, we've got to get both of those back up and running. I'll stop there.
Thanks for laying all that out for us, Flory. Angela, off to you. Multilateralism, I think, looking at current activity at the WTO, I thought it was interesting that the Brazilians, with the Bolsonaro 40% IEEPA tariffs, they went ahead and filed a case at the WTO, and we went ahead and participated in that case. I'm just wondering if you can paint for us, just in light of all your recent experience, an accurate picture of what is going on there right now. Where might be the seeds of, where we can move forward?
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question. So great pleasure to be here at a WITA event. Thanks to Ken and Diego, of course, Kelly for moderating, and my fellow panelists. Great to see you all from far-flung places all over the world. So multilateralism is still alive, and I almost said alive and well. I don't want to overstate the well, but multilateralism is still functioning. WTO members are still participating, even the US. And there is, I think, at the same time, a sense that while multilateralism is incredibly valuable, it's very much in need of reform. And so that is the key focus right now. But back in early January, when the US started to announce tariffs, and all of this uncertainty developed. What happened in the WTO was you saw our Director General arguing to members to please take a pause, not to react immediately, and to use the tools, if they're helpful, of the WTO to address the uncertainty. And you'll find that's what many members did. In fact, there are few members that have actually taken retaliation against the US. As you mentioned, Brazil has brought a case under the WTO dispute settlement. And the WTO itself has been providing to those members that ask data to analyze what the impact of the tariffs would be and what the impact of retaliation would be. And I think that's been very important to show to WTO members that taking retaliation may feel good immediately. It may scratch a political itch. But at the same time, it creates even more uncertainty back home. So I think many members have taken that to heart. But then in terms of the WTO itself, what comes next? The General Counsel of the WTO has been meeting for the last 2 days. Key topic, of course, being WTO reform. And the acknowledgement that multilateralism very rightly deserves criticism, but at the same time, there are a lot of benefits. You don't see members talking about withdrawing from the WTO. You hear members talk about trying to make the system better. Now, they may have very different views about what making the system better might be, but still that conversation is happening. And in fact, the fundamental reality for the WTO is that its great superpower is also its kryptonite, its Achilles heel, to mix metaphors. And that is the fact that it's member driven, that it is not a secretariat that imposes its will on members, but it's the WTO members themselves that make decisions and determinations about how best, as sovereign members, they are to address their economic and trade policy. So I think there is a very broad recognition, as I said, that the WTO needs reform. For many, there are design flaws, as Mike Froman pointed out in his article in Foreign Affairs about a month ago. In terms of the rules themselves that don't address particular behaviors, of course, for the US, the concern relating to non-market economies, overcapacity, industrial subsidies, some of the things that we've been mentioning here that Chris has mentioned. There are also concerns about consensus, because as you know, the WTO operates by consensus, which means that everyone must agree, or at least decide not to disagree, in order for any action to take place. And there are some key areas in which just 1 or 2 members, India for one, has blocked action. And that's made it hard to reach agreements. Unilateralism, how is that dealt with in the multilateral trading system, is a concern, not just from the US, but from many other members as well. The fact that dispute settlement right now has, because the US has blocked the use of the appellate body, there's a lack of finality in decisions, but still members are using it. Another big problem with respect to the WTO is the lack of notifications and transparency. When you take particular actions, you're supposed to notify the other members of the WTO, and the rate of notification is not very good, and it needs to improve. And then we have members threatening the WTO budget in order to get particular outcomes. So that's also all problems in need of reform. But at the same time, when you consider what the multilateral system has done, the multilateral trading system, I think that's something quite noteworthy that members do talk about. So, for example, just 2 weeks ago, the U.S. And many other members were part of the accession of the fish subsidies agreement. It entered into force. So we have a new agreement in the rule book that took almost 25 years to negotiate. It is not the full set of obligations, perhaps, that some members want to see, but it is incredibly important in ending the worst forms of fisheries subsidies, banning them, and creating more transparency and notifications. This is a meaningful agreement. It represents that consensus can happen and that members are willing to take the steps, not only at the ministerial level to agree, which happened back in 2022, but also to take the domestic steps to ratify the agreement, to go to their legislatures, to take those steps. So incredibly important there. I would also note that in terms of the multilateral trading system, that despite the tariffs, 72% of all trade is still undertaken on an MFN basis. That's down from 84% at the beginning of the year, but it's still incredibly high. There is a lot of trade that goes on that still is at MFN rates, that still is under those WTO rules, and we've seen little retaliation. Now, the WTO, of course, is about more than tariffs. Sometimes I think that when we talk about trade, we talk about trade in goods and we talk about tariffs because that is the hot issue right now. But as we know, the WTO is about more than tariffs. It's about trade and services. It's about SPS, sanitary, phytosanitary standards for agriculture. TBT, technical barriers to trade. Those are industrial standards that are set pretty much using U.S. procedures and rules that the rest of the world has undertaken as part of the WTO. So incredible value for the U.S. there. Intellectual property is another example, not to mention the issues of our time, climate change, environment, AI. Those things are being discussed in the WTO. And I think one value of the multilateral trading system is that everyone can be at the table to try to address those particular issues. Also, in terms of the multilateral trading system, dispute settlement, as I mentioned, as Chris mentioned, still is being used. You know, when you consider the statistics, since the appellate body became non-functional, there have been 48 requests for consultations. And there have been 41 panel reports. 15 of them have been adopted without appeal. The parties just agreed to adopt them. And 28 cases have been resolved by mutual agreement. Now, of course, 32 have been appealed into the void. So it's not good, but still the system is working in many important ways for members, bringing them to agreement about particular disputes that they may have about them. I would say as well, you know, there's been talk about should we move to plurilateralism, and here I would say that the WTO rules allow for plurilateralism. It's baked into the system. There are measures, the government procurement agreement, for example, is a plurilateral agreement. We have the investment facilitation for development agreement, the IFDA, which some 130 of the 166 members have signed on to. Now, the problem is for a multilateral agreement like the WTO, when you have plurilateralism, you need to dock that plurilateral agreement into the multilateral rulebook. But there are procedures for that. and requires consensus. India and South Africa and Turkey right now are blocking IFDA, but the discussions are underway. But I would say even more broadly, in terms of plurilateralism and bilateral agreements and some of the regional agreements that we've been talking about, the WTO was never, the members when joining the WTO and establishing the WTO never said that there shouldn't be any other mechanism. There is a variable geometry when it comes to the structure of trade relationships. And certainly I know from my time on the Hill that bilateral FTAs sometimes can be more ambitious and can push members along in terms of the rules to something that is more multilateral. But I think, in terms of plurilateralism outside of the WTO or in lieu of the WTO rules, there are some important things to keep in mind. If you go small, in other words, just a coalition of the willing to avoid those who maybe are not so willing, the effect of your agreement is going to be limited. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it's not a panacea in terms of solving all these problems if you're leaving out key members. And the deep-seated problems still don't go away. And some things cannot really be done except through a multilateral process, like industrial subsidies, for example, or issues
Or ag
with
subsidies. Ask the Brazilians.
or ag subsidies
Yeah.
or environment. So these are all things that have to be taken into account. But I think the final crucial point I would make is that WTO members are still very actively participating in the process. And the discussion is about how to fix it and make it even more effective. But I think a very realistic assessment at the same time of its shortcomings.
Thank you for that, Angela. Deb, I'm going to flip over to you. You planted a seed with respect to the future of investment and trade partnership. That is an initiative that I think has not gotten a lot of focus in Washington. I was hoping you could double click on that and just elaborate a bit more. Also, something you've written about quite a bit lately is just the challenges around having any sort of an integrated, coordinated approach. I think you were writing primarily with respect to Southeast Asia, but I think the point actually goes more broadly beyond your region. Wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about where countries have tried to think about having a coordinated approach to U.S. trade policy and or China, and where the challenges have come about and the opportunities.
Sure, thanks very much. I'll try to be short. On FITP, which can I just say to the audience, if you have a better acronym, please let us know. Please let somebody know, because this FITP is terrible. Anyway, FITP is it's an initiative by small states. It was particularly driven by Singapore, New Zealand, and the UAE. The idea was we are small trade-dependent economies. We don't have a lot of leverage on our own, but collectively we could actually get some interesting things started as a adjunct to the WTO system. So it's not intended, let me just be clear, to replace the WTO or to do, it's really sort of how can we start to catalyze conversations in a different setting with countries that have a stake in the system surviving, and especially, and I think this is also key perhaps to this audience, deliver some concrete actionable results for the business community as quickly as possible. So they're going to officially launch next month in November in Singapore, and then they'll have rotating heads. And the idea, I think, is to really get ideas in from members and from the government, businesses operating in these 14 economies about what could they do. So I think for me, this is an interesting approach to chaos, which is how do we collectively come together and explore opportunities that otherwise wouldn't be perhaps exploited given the, things were business as usual, but here we are, let's try something new. So I think FITP is interesting. It's one of the rare opportunities to really get a coalition together. This was not started, just to be clear, against the United States as such or against China. It was really lots of reasons why the global system is stuck. Could we come up with something creative and interesting? On the why can't we get a coordinated response to the US? That's a tougher question because it seems logical that you should be able to do so. But actually, let's just take Southeast Asia, for example. We had 1 day of coordination. So 1 day of coordination led by Malaysia. They said, let's have a collective response to this. Let's say that we find this unacceptable. And it fell apart the next day, right? So why? Lots of reasons, but the piece that I did for the Heinrich Foundation last week had sort of 4 reasons, and I'll just go through them very quickly. So one is that we have differential impact of tariffs. So even within the 10 members of ASEAN, Singapore is sitting at a 10% reciprocal rate. Most of ASEAN is at 19 or 20, and then we have 2 countries at 40. And the challenge is, given that differential rate, just the headline rate is different. If you're sitting at 10, do you want to stick your head above the parapet and argue on behalf of someone who's sitting at 40? The answer is no. And then you also have differential impacts in terms of the actual impact on your trade. So the headline figure might be 19, but actually you're better off relative to someone else in the same sector exporting to the United States. So it's not just that the rates are different, it's that the rates are different compared to your competitors. And so then you say, well, do I really want to coordinate if actually I am better off than they are? Maybe I'm just happy. Of course, I pay more, or at least US consumers and businesses pay more for my things, but at least I'm not the worst hit. So that's sort of the second reason. And then the third one, I think, is usually when you form a coalition, you have to be able to say to the potential members of the coalition, it's better to be with us than not with us. And I think right now that's very challenging to say to anyone because it's unclear who's leading this sort of coalition, if you will. And it's unclear what exactly are you proposing to do and how might that be countered. That's challenging. And then the last explanation that I came up with, which I think is useful, is especially here in Asia, there is a trade-off, or at least a balance to be struck between economic integration with the US and security and politics. And in particular, a lot of Asian governments have said, actually, on balance, we'll take a lousy economic deal if we have to ensure that our security remains intact. And so that balance, I think, is challenging. Maybe that's more of an Asia thing, but it's sort of top of mind for a lot of governments. And so the net result of that is, despite incentives to do so, their coordination and cooperation has proven difficult, but I think the conditions are starting to change and changing pretty rapidly.
Which is kind of by design, right? I mean, that's why President Trump likes the divide and conquer, strategy, because you don't have to run faster than the bear. You just have to run faster than your friend that you're hiking with, which is, a bit of the dynamic that we're seeing in your region.
Yes, but if the chaos continues and if you've got a deal and it doesn't stay, like if the deal stuck and held, you would have more incentive to just say, let me get a deal. But if the deal doesn't stick and if the demands continue to escalate, then you say, well, actually, this doesn't sound as great to me. And so I think we're kind of at that tipping point where US policy has been so chaotic for so long and seems to be set to continue. Maybe now you start to get the coalition that says actually being with us is better than being not with us, whatever that coalition might look like.
Yeah. And speaking of chaos, this 40% tariff that will ostensibly be placed on transshipped goods, I might have missed it, but I've not seen rules of origin emerge on that. How are folks in the region looking at that question?
That's the number one question, or has been the number one question since the beginning of this announcement of reciprocal tariffs in particular, and this 40% transshipment, because of course everybody's highly dependent on supply chains that run through the region. Chinese content is a key part of that. So if we're talking about transshipment, what are the rules? If we're talking about transshipment with Chinese content or Chinese characteristics, what is that? Every question, every single trade partner, certainly in Asia, has been asking that question, and they're not getting a lot of answers back from the US.
Yeah.
They keep getting told it'll be here soon, you'll get the information soon. We're all the way now into October, still don't have that information. It's a bit challenging. And I will say, sort of in a way on and off the record, there are a number of firms in the region now who are starting to say, well, we don't even know what the rules are. There's no way for us to comply with rules we don't have. And guess what? The US government is shut down and there aren't as many staff as there were. And so screw it. We're just going to ship stuff and hope for the best. This is not a strategy, let me say, that I think is a good one. Don't do it. But I am telling you that I'm hearing from firms that they're doing it anyways. It's happening.
Yeah. No, thanks for that, Deb. Chris, to pivot to you, I mean, as you were going through just the current state of play in Brussels and in Europe writ large, and talking about the change in dynamic, and we've got the Mercosur agreement that's going to the member state votes. It sounds like you're guardedly optimistic that that'll go through, but then that's what I think about as I see Europe becoming more ambitious with respect to trade deals. I mean, the Indonesia deal, of course, the first thing that came to my mind is labor and environmental standards. How is that going to happen? So just could you give us a bit more insight to that dynamic, and to what extent has the mindset really shifted, and Europeans are recognizing we need additional deals, and so we're going to have to swallow some things that historically might have been tough for us.
Yeah, I think the EU might have realized that the expansion, that the Brussels effect, this sort of fabled kind of ability of the EU to almost by osmosis kind of apply its own regulatory standards to its trading partners. That process might have reached its limits. There are all sorts of things that the EU is doing, which a lot of supplier countries are really unhappy about at the moment, notably CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which will you're not supposed to call it a tax, but it is going to be a tax on imports of high carbon goods from anywhere that cannot account for the carbon pricing that has gone into the production of those products. The United States doesn't have a carbon pricing system, so guess what? The US is going to get clobbered in principle. There's all of these things. There's the EU's anti-deforestation regulation, which sounded like a great idea. Let's make sure that we don't import, soya or palm oil from places where they're chopping down forests in order to grow it. But in practice, it's creating a lot of headaches in terms of how you apply it. What concessions do you make to developed countries or smaller exporters in developed countries? All of these things are quite complicated. The EU recently deferred the implementation of its anti-deforestation regulation for a further year to give more time for these things to come into effect. And the EU likes to see itself as a leader in environmental questions in terms of climate change implementation and enforcement of the Paris Agreement, things like that. And it has made this part of an essential part of some of the trade agreements that it's done. But it's found that it's a lot easier to do this with countries that were always going to uphold these standards anyway, like New Zealand. Talking to countries like Indonesia or some of the other Southeast Asian countries which the EU is negotiating, is not going to be quite so straightforward. So I think the EU is realizing that it's going to have to soft pedal a little bit, that it can't quite kind of expand its view of the world across the world the way it should be through free trade agreements in the way that it might have hoped it could maybe 5 or 10 years ago. And there's also perhaps a bit more realism and pragmatism, given the current state of global trade, given the current state of the WTO. It's more a question of what can we get that can be delivered, rather than what would we ideally like to have. Now let's see if we can make it work.
No, well done. Well put. I'm wondering if you think that this change in mentality, if it might be nudged along by the very apparent strategy of the Trump administration with respect to 232s. I know that Europe may have some type of carve-outs on the 232s, but no matter what the Supreme Court does next month, it's very clear that train is going to continue to barrel forward, covering major swaths of U.S. imports. I was hoping you might speak to that a bit, Chris.
Yeah, well, one of the favorite parlor games at the moment among trade nerds in the UK is the game of, does the UK have a better trade deal than the EU with the United States? It's great fun. One of the things which the EU has is a commitment to a maximum tariff of 15% on all and every product, including, for example, pharmaceuticals, which is the subject of a 232 investigation at the moment, which the UK doesn't have. It is undoubtedly a concern. I mean, the EU believes that an agreement is an agreement is an agreement. That's the way. That's it very much in its DNA. And if you talk to people in Brussels, they say we're protected. The US has said, 15% maximum on everything. You don't need to worry. Here in the UK, we're a bit less sanguine about what that might mean. Countries like outside of the EU, like Switzerland, for example, which has been particularly hard done by with the 39% tariff, which has been applied on Swiss exports. They are very much scrabbling to make sense of how they approach this. But the EU has a formidable trade negotiating team. I think they have done a deal with the US, which they think is going to stand up in all of the most important areas, even if a lot of the detail hasn't been nailed down yet. And certainly that is the line that they are taking and will continue to take until and unless they are disabused of it at some point in the future.
No, terrific. Thank you, Chris. Flora, I'm going to give you the last word. Do you think that there is still, thinking of all your comments before, there's still an opening for the United States on the continent? I mean, one of my frustrations as a Latin Americanist has been that I feel like there is an opening in Latin America because you do have some of the chickens coming home to roost on Belt and Road Initiative, promised investments that didn't always materialize from China. And as you pointed out, that dynamic in Africa is the same in Latin America. There really is a desire to work with US companies and to work with the United States when possible. So perhaps you could, I hope, end on an optimistic note in the couple of minutes we have left with respect to, is there still more we can do?
Well, I do want to mention one thing that I should have mentioned earlier is that for the first time, we have the opportunity of working with a continental market. We have the African Continental Free Trade Area. It's, I think, the second largest free trade market in the world. And you have 1.3 billion people and a combined GDP of $4.3 trillion. And the reason that that's important is because, as people look to trade with and invest in Africa, there's always been the question, there are 54 countries, you can't invest in all of them. The opportunities are not equal across the continent. But if you could look at the regional opportunities or even continental opportunities, how do you invest in one country and then look at expanding across maybe the East Africa region or the West Africa region, or maybe even have a whole sub-Saharan Africa strategy. And a lot of our member companies are doing that and trying to learn more about how the AFCFTA can actually be helpful to US companies who are already invested in Africa and looking to expand. So the positive here is that the renewal of AGOA, we're going to claim it, that it will indeed happen, is for the first time going to, is going to occur when there is a continental market where they're developing regional supply chains and where US companies will be well positioned to take advantage of that and to work with the Africans across those key supply chains. So again, on a positive note, US companies are still looking at Africa. There are some that have maybe drawn back a little bit, but there are lots of investment opportunities there. And this larger market, not to mention the fact that by 2050, 60% of the global labor market will be there. I think we know about the youth bulge in Africa. The rest of the world is getting older while Africa is getting younger. And this will also have a major impact on opportunities, not just for the US in Africa, but for Europe in Africa, for Asia in
Absolutely.
Africa.
Yeah.
So just to put it on a global scale, Africa, I believe, I'm prejudiced, but Africa, I believe, is the continent that offers the greatest opportunities to grow the global economy for a whole variety of reasons. And there are no issues that we can resolve if we're not looking at Africa and how to resolve them there.
Well, let's
So
hope we
I
take
think that's
advantage of that,
that's the
Flory.
note I'd like to end on.
Thank you so much. Thanks to you, Chris, Deb, of course, Angela. Thank you for walking us through where we are on multilateralism. And Ken, off to you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Really, really appreciate your comments. Point out that Angela was one of the key leaders in passing the original AGOA and wrote eloquently about it on a LinkedIn post
Absolutely.
recently. So grateful to all of you, Kelly, Angela, Deborah. Thanks, Deborah, for staying up so late in Singapore for us. Chris, Flory, pleasure to have you on. Thank you to all our panelists for this discussion. Before we start our last session, I'd like to give a shout out to our WITA team and our interns who work behind the scenes to make the 2025 WITA Intensive Trade Seminar a reality. Diego Añez, WITA's Managing Director, Maya Ghazi, WITA's Associate Director, our WITA Fellows, Rafael Augusto Centino and Callie Hummel, and our WITA interns, Margot Severine from the Georgia Institute of Technology and Michele Mancuso at Florida International University. Thank you for your help with the 2025 Intensive Trade Seminar. For our last session of the seminar, I'd like to ask them to please turn on their cameras. We're going to discuss one of the biggest issues facing U.S. trade policymakers, companies, workers, and consumers in the months to come, the review and expected updating of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, USMCA, or CUSMA as it's known in Canada, TMEC as it's known in Mexico. It was negotiated first by President Trump and his team in his first term to update and revise the original NAFTA. USMCA had a built-in 6-year review mechanism that's already underway, and there's a pretty strong certainty that it will be renegotiated next year. To help us understand the process and some of the key issues that may be addressed and discussed are for people who played key roles in both the negotiation and implementation of USMCA. Patrick Childress is a partner at Holland & Knight and a former Assistant General Counsel, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. My friend Thea Lee, a distinguished visiting practitioner at American University. She's the former Deputy Undersecretary for International Labor Affairs. Greta Peich is a partner at Wiley Ryan and a former General Counsel at the Office of the U.S. Trade Rep and a former International Trade Counsel in the Senate Finance Committee. And our moderator, Sarah Stewart, who's the CEO and Executive Director of the Silverado Policy Accelerator. Sarah also served as a formerly as a Assistant Deputy U.S. Trade Rep for Environment and Natural Resources during the discussion of the first negotiation of the USMCA. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much, Ken. It's so exciting to be here and also frightening at the same time that this much time has already elapsed from the end of negotiation of USMCA, and here we are at the inflection point of the review. It's great to also be here to talk to the WITA Academy. So I thought that I would just offer a little bit of history, and then we're going to dive right into it. So, for many in the trade community, we grew up learning all about NAFTA, or maybe we were involved in some of the NAFTA negotiations. And at that time, it was a quite novel agreement. In the intervening years, though, from 1994 forward, there was a lot of emphasis that was placed on trade policy. And there was a lot of growth during that time. Congress had a big role, stakeholders had a big role, different presidents had a big role, and we saw real evolution of what was included in our free trade agreements. And so, by the late, 2015, 2016, and later timeframe, NAFTA started to look pretty outdated as compared to newer FTAs. So a lot of things changed during the USMCA negotiation. We saw issues like labor and environment, for example, that had been side letters in NAFTA, which was, again, novel at the time, incorporated into the body of the agreement, made enforceable like other provisions. We saw the inclusion of digital trade commitments and many other things that, needed to be updated. But one thing that's going to be the subject of today's discussion was the inclusion of a first of its kind review mechanism. We haven't had this in any of our other trade agreements that I'm aware of, so correct me if I'm wrong, but it was a novel trade provision. And so we're going to dig in to understand a little bit more about what does that review mechanism mean? What's likely to play out, how the different legislative, executive branch, and stakeholders are going to feed into it. So, Pat, we're going to start with you. And maybe you could talk a little bit about the origins of the review provision. Why was it included in USMCA? What is the process that the executive branch is undertaking right now as part of the review?
Thanks a lot, Sarah. Yeah, why don't I start with the timeline moving forward for the review, because I think this will help ground the discussion in the concrete steps that folks will need to have in mind as they think about how to engage in the review process. And this timeline is set through a combination of the treaty itself, but then also the US implementing legislation as well. So the first big deadlines coming up are November 3rd, 2026, approaching very soon. That's the date on which written stakeholder comments are due. That's also the date when stakeholders will need to request to appear at the in-person hearing in DC. And that hearing is going to take place on November 17th. The next big date to keep in mind is January 1st, 2026. This is the date on which USTR needs to put forward its recommendations to Congress. So I think that this whole period around January 1st, so really throughout the winter, is going to be very pivotal in terms of congressional engagement on USMCA review. The next big date is January 1st, 2026. That's the date on which the USMCA parties need to provide recommendations for potential changes to the other parties to the treaty. And then finally, the big date is this July 1st, 2026 date, which per the treaty is sort of the official date of the review. But as we all know, negotiations have already started and they're going to continue from now all the way up into July 1st, 2026. So I think the big question on everyone's mind is, what is this review actually going to look like? So if you look at the text of the treaty, the text is pretty clear that this is a simple review. However, given the state of the North American trading relationships and the US administration's generally aggressive approach to trade policy thus far, our full expectation is that this so-called review is going to turn into a full-scale renegotiation. So what does that mean for stakeholders? I think there are a lot of risks and opportunities here as well. First to the risks, a lot of businesses have built their business models based on the USMCA structure. And so the fact that the USMCA is going to undergo this full-scale renegotiation does present some potential risk for businesses because the rules of the road could change potentially in some dramatic ways. But I think there's also opportunities here as well. Again, I think the US administration in particular is going to be approaching the renegotiation looking for new ideas that it can propose and put forward during the renegotiation process. So what does that mean? Not all proposals are going to be considered equal by this administration. I think the administration has been very clear on what its trade policy priorities are. And it's really three things. The first is increasing US manufacturing. The second is increasing American jobs. And the third is lowering US trade deficits. So to the extent that you're a stakeholder with a policy proposal, i.e. a proposal for a change to USMCA, to the extent that you can frame that proposal in ways that are going to resonate with the administration, i.e. ways that will that are going to work well with these three policy priorities that I just laid out. I think there is a big opportunity here to find willing allies within the administration who would be willing to take up the right policy proposals and put them forward as a part of the trilateral process. Let's see, maybe I'll pause there, but I'd love to hear from the other panelists to see what their thoughts are on what they think sort of the scope of the review is going to be.
That's great. And I think that you've offered some really good advice. And I want to just ask you one follow-up before we go to Greta, which is, do you see a world where the timelines that have been set could shift? And do we know, is Canada and Mexico undertaking a similar review process with their own stakeholders? Because that will obviously be part of like the broader sort of like political equation.
Yeah, it's a great question. And Canada and Mexico do have their own stakeholder engagement processes, which are ongoing now. So to the extent that you do have a proposal for a change to USMCA that you're hoping to put forward as a part of this process, it may very well make sense to engage not just with the US stakeholder engagement process, but also to think about whether to engage in the Canadian process and or the Mexican process. Because it could be the case that if you have a great idea for a change to the treaty, it might be helpful to elevate that policy proposal on all sides of the negotiating table. So not just making the US administration aware of it, but also the Canadians and the Mexicans as well.
Great, thank you. Well, and I'll say, Greta and Thea, please do also add in any comments additional on the executive branch. But Greta, maybe first, you held a very senior role as general counsel at USTR, but prior to that, you also had a very senior role on the Hill on the Senate Finance Committee, and you were part of all of the original USMCA negotiations, and you saw that process sort of developing. How can you describe to us, is there anything in the USMCA sort of treaty framework that is going to give Congress either a consultative role here? Do they have to vote on whatever comes out of this negotiation? How do you see the congressional role this time around?
Sure. So maybe backing up a little bit on the process. So I would say, one, the process itself was the result of a negotiation, and not just with the parties, but also with Congress. So the Trump administration, and I kind of think of the process as it is in USMCA as a bit, I don't know a better word, funky, because you have this review that starts in 6 years, and then you have a 10-year continuation period of the agreement where you keep talking about any issues for 10 years. That's the model that is out there. And really, that's not where the Trump administration had started in the way they were thinking about this, but Congress and the other trading partners, wanted more certainty. And we ended up with the review process we have, and that's because of the leverage at the time that Congress had, because it was going to be passing an implementing bill to put the new agreement in place. And to kind of keep that in context, because it had quite a bit of leverage that it exercised to shape the agreement, including on this review process. And so, we're in a very different situation now. We don't expect USTR to put forward a new implementing bill to have the kind of changes that would require this. So, in my mind, in part, this is a new test in the second Trump administration as to whether Congress can and will assert itself. And I think that we can see that play out through a few different dynamics. One, to get to part of your question, the congressional checks on this review process, they exist, but they're pretty weak. They're in the statute itself. So there's a consultation process that's required for the president to undertake with Congress, with the committees before the review process. There's a report due to Congress from USTR 180 days before that next year, July deadline. And then follow-up briefings and the results of the review, actions taken, and continued engagement as that review continues, say, through those 10 years. But there's no consequences in this statute, even if the administration chose not to follow those provisions. And, you know, like any consultation process, it's really just an opportunity to be heard. It's not an opportunity or a requirement to take into account or act on the views of Congress. And so on the flip side, USTR is in a very strong position under US law, so long as they don't need Congress to act, which again, they likely don't. They're unlikely to pursue any changes that would require congressional action. And they can make a lot of changes under the implementing act without that. They can change tariffs. They can change many of the rules of origins, which are sort of feel like the stickier provisions. And they can revise other parts of the agreement. We saw this in the first Trump administration when they renegotiated the Korea FTA in part. They do have to have advice from advisory committees and the ITC in order to make changes to tariffs from the International Trade Commission. In order to make changes to tariffs, they have to have a report to the committees. So there's a process, but it's not a process where there's an opportunity to stop the administration from making the changes and taking the actions that they are seeking to change. That said, I would say Congress will have a strong influence, and I believe will be trying to and likely will influence where the review process will go. When the renegotiation, the first renegotiation happened of NAFTA, one thing that was stunning on the Hill was there was a huge education campaign from various stakeholders about both the benefits and the problems with NAFTA. And you had a lot of members who had perspectives, but they didn't really have as deep of an understanding of the trade between the partners and the various levers and interests. And so it was really fascinating to experience and see members just become really engaged. And I think that that's a place where there's opportunity, again, for stakeholders to not only engage with the administration, as Pat said, but also to reignite that interest and that softer influence that Congress has to direct where the administration should go. And Congress could find leverage potentially, right? There are IEEPA tariffs on Mexico and Canada. There is, a mechanism to terminate those emergencies by Congress, for example. I think that those levers are unlikely to be utilized, but they're out there, and it'll be interesting to watch how this negotiation, how the outcomes shift or evolve the policy making on trade even further among Congress and the administration. One other point just to highlight is that rewinding our minds back to that NAFTA renegotiation, the sort of leverage that was used then was termination of the agreement, right? President Trump talked about terminating the agreement. That was what brought the parties to the table. That is what really ignited Congress to get involved and to become educated about the benefits as well as the reforms that were needed in NAFTA. The administration could still terminate the agreement outside of the review process, right? The termination provision, it is unilateral. There is no explicit congressional constraint on that provision. So that is in the backdrop and continues to be. So notwithstanding this sort of rather complex and funky review process, that fundamental dynamic, doesn't change. I think it's helpful for everybody to keep that in mind when we think about how the various actors are considering this. And so, I do think that stakeholders in particular who have strong interests are best served by exercising all engagement and policy levels in the US government, including Congress. But I think it's to be seen how those power dynamics play out in this process.
I think those are excellent points in understanding the history and the leverage points and how this might go. One quick follow-up question for you, and then we'll go to Thea, is, to what extent do you think that Canada and Mexico are following domestic politics here? So we've got midterm elections that are coming up just a few months after, the July 1st meeting. Will that play a role in what the US may or may not do? Like, how closely do trading partners look at what's happening, in domestic politics as sort of a bellwether of what they can expect in the negotiation?
They do follow it closely. I think, like everyone else, they have a hard time predicting what's going to happen in our politics, but they also engage with the Hill, for example. I mean, this is what we're talking about with Congress. And so they also look for partners and for avenues to educate and share their views about the trading relationship with key members of Congress. And it's another sort of avenue for them to engage with the US government, but they do watch it closely, and they are calculating, where this could go next year and beyond, and where we will be in our electoral politics at that time.
Well, anybody who's worked on trade knows that elections can be won and lost on this issue. So, I think that the role of stakeholders who are voters is really important. How they engage with the process, both, formally, informally, through trade associations, through advisory committees. All of those things can make a big difference in the trajectory of, where not just the US position may go, but also where trading partners' positions may go. So this is the perfect topic for Thea. And I hope, Thea, that you can maybe, talk to us a little bit about your expertise. I mean, you've been on the front lines as a stakeholder in various different negotiations, not just USMCA. Maybe talk about, the role of stakeholders in the, lead up to negotiations, but also after the negotiations are done, during that implementation phase, or even during the phase where Congress is considering whether or not to move forward with it for a vote. And then I hope that you can include in your comments a little bit about the rapid response mechanism, which was a key feature of the labor movement's, sort of proposals and work with the administration during USMCA, and how has that panned out?
Okay, just a few things to talk about. Good morning, Sarah, Greta, Patrick. Many thanks for the invitation to come chat with you today. So this is an interesting moment in the USMCA history, and I do think it's important to sort of think back, like, why did we have the review? One of the reasons, in my view, why we even have the 6-year review is a little bit of a safety valve. It's because there was such a high level of opposition and discomfort and unhappiness with the original NAFTA for whatever, from different pieces. And so even though Bob Lighthizer, as we all know, is tremendously skilled in, stakeholder outreach, and I think it's important to note for the USMCA that if Bob Lighthizer had not built really strong relationships of trust with a lot of union leaders, and of course Democrats in Congress like Sherrod Brown and others, where he was not just checking a box, he was really listening to what people said, and he included a lot of that. And I think that was essential to in the end, not complete support, but bipartisan support for USMCA. But it also means that this moment is really fraught. And the other thing, I loved this quote I wanted to share from Gary Huffbauer. Some of you remember from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, because he and I, in the first NAFTA, we were always put up against each other. We were always debating about NAFTA. And he, at some point, expressed his frustration in a quote in the newspaper where he said something like, trade policy used to be the province of a small group of people, of experts at Treasury. And now it's TV talk show material. And so, but I think, Sarah, the point that you made about the importance of stakeholders goes also to what Greta said and what Patrick said, that, in the end of the day, Congress is going to decide, is it popular or unpopular? And so that's just a way for me to say how important the review process can be and should be, because for having diverse views, and I think this was certainly my experience in the many years, the early 90s, the NAFTA, the WTO, was that labor always felt like an outsider, like business was in the room, business was calling the shots, business and USTR made all the decisions, and the labor unions and civil society were very much on the outside, very much marginalized. And that, I would argue, is one of the reasons why trade agreements seemed to serve the purposes of big corporations, but not working people, and why a lot of people hated them. But on the other hand, the USMCA labor chapter and the rapid response mechanism were really important breakthroughs. They were path breaking. And I think they're seen that way in most of the labor movement. There's also a lot of frustration, a lot of ways in which we can talk about that later. People would want to strengthen or change or improve the transparency or the coverage or the processes around the RRM. But I think it's just worth stating that this is the most expansive labor chapter in any trade agreement in the world and the most powerful dispute settlement mechanism. And I do think that over the last 4 or 5 years, we have demonstrated that the US government under both the Biden and the Trump administrations was very enthusiastically and energetically enforcing that chapter. And yet, it's not enough. And I think it's important to recognize, like, some of the criticism that will come is like, hey, but we're still losing jobs to Mexico, and we didn't close the wage gap between the United States and Mexico. I would argue that it maybe wasn't realistic to think that 4 or 5 years of implementation of a labor chapter in a trade agreement would change that dynamic in the short run. I think what it did change, with Mexico's very strong implementation of their own labor law reform, which was written into USMCA, but I think there was no question that AMLO and the labor secretary were on board, that they wanted to reform Mexico's labor laws. They wanted to change the industrial relations system so that unions were able to negotiate and represent workers and not have that system of corrupt protection unions that had been in place for maybe 60 years in Mexico. So that was very successful in Mexico. I think we can point, and I know USTR had great numbers, about 40,000 workers maybe received a raise because of the RRM and the USMCA labor chapter changes. And many workers were reinstated after having been illegally fired for trying to organize a union. And many, many concrete improvements happened in Mexico. And yet, there's still the sense, and I think you see it from the UAW, and I think there was a quote that I had here from Public Citizen, or no, not Public, from Rethink Trade. The USMCA has not delivered on the top line promises to end the race to the bottom in wages and labor conditions or to balance regional trade. But that's maybe, I think to be expected that this is a pretty big difference in living standards, big difference in the industrial organization. But I think it goes to Patrick's point, which is also important, which is to say that from the labor movement's point of view, increasing U.S. manufacturing, increasing U.S. jobs, and closing the trade deficit are definitely top-line goals. And so you can say that there's something to be said there, that there is a shared set of priorities. Whether we agree on how to get there or how to amend USMCA in order to get there, I think is the big important question. So many frustrations and obstacles, but also a recognition that there's a lot at stake here. A lot at stake because the USMCA labor chapter and the rapid response mechanism has been successful. And certainly from my point of view, we'd like to see it, more fully implemented. If you turn around right now and abrogate, as Greta said, the possibility that we would terminate the agreement and terminate those labor protections, that would be unfortunate. And a couple of other things that are just important to keep an eye on is that in addition to the implementation of the labor chapter, Congress gave a lot of resources to ILAB, the International Labor Affairs Bureau that I headed at DOL, in order to make sure that this process moved smoothly. $180 million over the course of 4 or 5 years of technical assistance. We hired 5 labor attachés who are all in Mexico, 3 in Mexico City, 1 in Monterrey, 1 in Tijuana. And those are essential elements to the success of the labor chapter. And I think the question is completely open right now. Will those be continued? Will there be continued support for them? And just the last piece, I think USTR Jamison Greer has gotten very high marks for his willingness to engage with labor and civil society, and very much in the mold of Bob Lighthizer, who didn't just check the box. There's a lot of checking the box. I sat on the Labor Advisory Committee for a long time. I sat on the ACPIN for a little while. And a lot of times it just felt like people were forced to meet with us and sit down and listen to labor complain about all the things they didn't like. And they didn't take notes. Nothing ever changed. They walked out the door and they were done with their consultation. So my hope for this round is that the consultation be meaningful and be really engaged, because I think in the end it will lead to a better outcome and also better politics.
Well,
I'll leave it there.
those are incredible insights, Thea, and insights that you could really only get in the roles that you've been in, including from the government perspective, which is another vantage point. I want to sort of take our conversation to some of the issues that we think are going to be front and center for this review process. And I also want to remind the audience that, we will save 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So please do put any questions in that Q&A box. But Thea, I may just keep with you for a moment, because one of the really interesting things about the rapid response mechanism is we've had dispute settlement in FTAs, right? So if there was a question over one party's compliance, there is dispute settlement that, the parties could avail themselves of. But the rapid response mechanism was different. It was faster, and had anticipated to lead to, quicker results on a faster time frame with somewhat less politics involved, and an understanding that there's still more room there. Do you think that this is a type of mechanism that could be used in other areas as well? And could be interesting to see how something like this could work, for environment or other sectors, where, dispute settlement has kind of been out there, but not necessarily a key feature in how, the parties are using leverage. And then any other thoughts that you have on issues that you think are going to bubble up, and then we'll go back to Pat and Greta for their thoughts as well.
Well, thanks for that question, Sarah. I'm a big fan of the rapid response mechanism. As you say, it's swift, it's surgical, and it's substantive. And so the speed is something clearly that the labor movement had complained about after the Guatemala CAFTA case took 9 years to resolve. I mean, people grow up and move away, they die and take other jobs, and if you take that long to resolve a labor complaint, it's not really going to be worth anything at the end. But the surgical piece, I think, was really interesting, that it was facility-specific mechanism. And, I think there was some playing with that, even in the discussions around the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum and others about, is there a way of adapting this? Is it too powerful? Because the idea that you can tailor a remedy to a single facility, a single factory, is really important, partly because, from our point of view, we want to be able to use our mechanism. And if the mechanism is too blunt, let's say you take GSP benefits away from an entire country, nobody's ever going to want to use it. But if you can say this particular factory is violating the law pretty egregiously, nobody else is going to cry if they have to fix that problem. And I would say, that the process worked pretty smoothly. We worked very closely with USTR. We were able to meet our deadlines for the most part, which was a minor miracle. And a lot of cases were resolved with remediation, which could be both a feature and a bug in the sense that, I think to me it's great if you can get the workers reinstated, get them back pay, get the independent, get the union, the election rerun in a way that, meets all the standards. That's a great outcome, and you don't have to use the trade sanction in order to accomplish it. On the other hand, I think some of the complaints from civil society and labor are that the remediation over the course of the time sort of came to a place where companies sort of knew what boxes they had to tick, but they weren't really willing to address the core issues that were there, like blacklisting and other kinds of recurrent problems. But I would love, and actually I'd love to hear from Greta and Patrick, and I'd love to hear from some of the folks on the phone, whether they see the rapid response mechanism as something that they think could be adapted to other areas.
Fantastic. Well, Pat, why don't we go to you and then to Greta, and then I see some questions are coming in. So we've got still quite a bit to bite off here.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, one comment on the RRM, just to frame it a bit more broadly in the context of the review. And that's, I think if you look at all the changes from NAFTA to USMCA, the RRM was probably the most novel and most creative change between those two treaties. It's also turned out to have been the most popular, in my view. And so in that way, I think the RRM could be seen as really paving a way for other creative approaches to make their way into the 6-year review process as well. So again, going back to a point I made earlier, if you're a stakeholder with a creative change to USMCA that you want to put forward, if you have a novel idea, particularly if this is an idea that you can frame in a way such that it's presented as supportive of the Trump administration's trade policies, then I think there absolutely is an opportunity here for you to put those ideas forward and get them taken up in these negotiations.
Fantastic. Do you want to offer any other thoughts of issues that you think are going to kind of bubble up?
Yeah, sure. So a couple, I think we expect to see a lot of action with respect to automotive rules of origin. That's already been very active under USMCA. I think that's clearly going to be a priority during the review. I think there's going to be a push for the three parties to norm on measures to counter Chinese investment and Chinese content and goods traded throughout North America. And then, I think there is likely going to be a push from Canada and Mexico to revisit the essential security exception. And of course, the United States will probably push back on that strongly. So I'm not sure if that will end up going anywhere, but I do think that that will be an issue that's on the table.
Greta, over to you.
Thanks. So first on the RM, I would say, it was incredibly exciting both to work on it on the Hill and then at USTR, I see it implemented. And I do think it holds promise as a template for other agreements or to expand in the USMCA context. I would say the biggest challenge there is resources. And this even gets to Thea's point about the remediation. You have a trade-off between volume and the extent you can devote resources to go, further down the process. And I think that's a real question as we look both at reforming the IRM to think about how can it be more impactful? What are the levers we have to make it have a wider impact in Mexico on the labor market, as well as how can and should we repeat it or adapt it for other agreements or other issues? The actual model for the RRM was the Peru forestry annex and the provisions there to block illegally traded timber. And so these, in some senses, it's the same as in other trade areas where one development builds on another. And I think we need to build on the RRM and think about how to make it even more effective going forward. I would agree with Pat. I mean, I think rules of origin, not just in autos, but across the board are going to be a really big issue for the United States. And I think it connects to this thinking about China and other third-party content with the idea of having more of the benefit of the agreement devolve to the member countries and also to the United States. And so I think we could also, in the auto space, we have the labor content value. Should we have that in other manufacturing sectors in order to push more of the labor to higher labor, markets, or to increase wages in Mexico itself, right? And so I think that that's going to be a huge part of the conversation. I think it will be interesting to see, where and how the 232 actions on Canada and Mexico come into play. It could be, attempts to rein in the essential security. It could be, attempts by the United States to memorialize it, right? Maybe this is just where we are and sort of thinking about tariffs and our relationship in some of these key sectors. I also think to be determined, because Canada and Mexico are separately talking to the United States now about many of the bilateral trade irritants, right? And which we have long lists of with both parties. We always have, some of which have been intractable. And I think a question is, where do those bilateral conversations flow into or keep separate from the USMCA conversation? Because I do think, at least for now, they're separate, and they may be an effort to kind of clear some of that brush away before we get to the USMCA. But I don't know, where we'll get there. And I think another question when we look at the negotiations and the negotiating dynamic is, does the administration approach this at the end of the day more like your sort of normal give and take trade agreement negotiations, which at the end of the day, USMCA was too, even though there was the threat of withdrawal? Or do they try to maintain this dynamic of, being the demander and wanting a real structural changes in these relationships that alter that dynamic from what we've seen before? But I think, to me, rules of origin and all of the bilateral issues are kind of at the top of mind for the administration. But I would agree with Pat. I mean, I think that there's a real willingness to think creatively and innovatively about the agreement and how to solve issues for U.S. companies, how to encourage U.S. manufacturing. So I think that there's an open door to ideas about how to do that.
Yeah, I think that those are all definitely, going to be in the mix. And I would say when we talk about rules of origin, and or, looking at North American content versus Chinese content or other foreign country content, it also, for me, raises the question of, do we have the mechanisms in place to be able to evaluate that? Do we have the data transparency that we need to be able to evaluate that? So I think that there's some really sort of granular details that are going to have to be part of any expansion of rules of origin, or frankly, and I love your all opinion on this, supply chains. We weren't even talking about supply chains back in 2018, at least not in the way that we do now. And now we're looking at, upstream inputs to downstream products. It's part of all of our conversations every day. Curious as to, do you think that the USMCA review will try and take that head on as kind of like a new issue, or do you think that it will be addressed kind of piecemeal through different chapters and sectoral annexes?
Well, I'll say one thing on that front, which is, one of the innovations, again, in the USMCA labor chapter was the forced import labor ban, where the US, of course, already had that in place, and Canada and Mexico agreed to implement and adopt their own forced labor import ban. That's also a pretty unique, interesting feature of USMCA. But I think it does start to address, and we actually heard from a lot of business people in both Canada and Mexico that they appreciated the idea of the forced labor import ban. Some of the Mexican business people were saying to us, can we do it faster? It's like, well, that's up to you. You're all going to have to figure out. I mean, it's obviously a very heavy lift, and we would bring, as Greta knows, our USTR and our customs and our labor folks together from the three countries so that we could try to at least help provide a little bit more clarity about how we did it. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but we're certainly further along. So I think that's an interesting piece, which is to say, like, hey, if we're going to be a North American market here and we're going to ban goods made with forced labor, it doesn't help us if they just go in through Mexico and Canada and then end up back in the United States. And it certainly doesn't help Mexico and Canada to be the recipients of a bunch of junk that got turned away from U.S. ports and ended up there. So I think that's one point. I would just add a few things about, issues to watch in the negotiations around labor. I think I mentioned lack of transparency. That's been one of the complaints. But I think also sectoral coverage. I mean, the USMCA and the rapid response mechanism doesn't cover agriculture, for example. And that does seem like a glaring omission, that this is clearly an important area. It's also an area where there are a lot of labor abuses. And so it would be interesting to see if there can be some expansion. But I think another issue, and this is one, Canada and Mexico probably have views on this, the lack of symmetry in the labor chapter, that especially the RRM really is only used to address labor abuses in Mexico, but not in the United States. And I would just say, from the point of view of an American labor advocate, that I think the U.S. should be subject to challenge on our labor actions too. And I see trade agreements as being a two-way street where we both make commitments, we both either live up to them or face possible challenges. And I think that's important that we begin to address all that as well. But I like that you raised the supply chain issue, Sarah, because I think it is a different way that we've been talking about some of our trade commitments. And I think it also goes to what USMCA really is. Is it a North American economic community, or is it just a trade agreement? And maybe we don't all agree on that.
Greta?
Sarah, I would say I think that the supply chain is already becoming a part of the conversation, maybe without even saying the word. So we have Canada and Mexico already raising tariffs on China, for example. And you saw this happening to a certain extent before the Trump administration even came into office. And I think it's a really interesting conversation to have as a trading bloc of how do we manage the overcapacity of manufactured goods coming from China and the impact on our regional competitiveness collectively, right? And I think that that's a good conversation for Canada and Mexico to engage in for their own self-interest and for their interest in making sure that we have that integrated manufacturing sector that is benefiting everybody in the long term. Because I think the reality is, we have a lot of tariffs on China. We have very high trade remedies on China because of unfair competition. But if we have free trade between us and it's uneven, that protection that we have to counteract those practices, then it's diluted for the United States in particular, but also for everybody. I think that there's a global conversation happening given just the extent of China's growing export trade balance, that there may be more need than we have thought about collectively as a global trading system to manage that impact that it's having. And so I think that that's the conversation, which is also supply chain, right? You can talk about it in different ways, and I think there's the sort of competitiveness issue as well. And some of these particular sensitive sectors may become, a focus, but I think we'll see whether there are particular tailored solutions for those issues.
Fantastic. Pat, did you have anything you wanted to add on that? And then we can jump to Q&A after that.
Sure. Just one sort of add-on thought there. But I think one issue to think about isn't just Chinese content, but it's also Chinese investment in North America as well. So I think there could be a big push in USMCA to limit certain investment from Chinese companies in North America. This would be companies looking to set up shop, for instance, in Mexico, and then use that as a base to produce Mexican origin products and then ship them to trading partners throughout North America, tariff-free under USMCA. So I think that's one other issue to keep an eye on. It could be the case that the parties to USMCA decide to address this investment issue as well.
That's a great point. I'm glad that you raised that. So I'm going to turn to the Q&A here. So one question is, what changes do you see likely coming to the auto rules? Will USMCA compliant tariff-free vehicle imports survive? Major changes to the regional value content, labor value content requirements, rules of origin, and a new US content requirement. I don't know if anybody wants to take that on.
I mean, I think that they will be looking for areas to strengthen, right? I think that this was one of the most detailed and one of the most highly touted areas of the first renegotiation. And I think that they'll be looking to further build on that. I think we don't know the answer of the tariff, what tariff, if any, will be on USMCA compliant. There's different levers to kind of pull. There are, the strengthening of the rule of origin, there's potential tariff and what level that would be. And I think we don't know at this stage where that's going to come out.
Right.
Yeah, maybe just one additional thought there. I think there might also be a push to try to, in some ways, modernize the rules of origin for autos. I think there's a thought within the community of automakers that perhaps the current rules of origin are focused too much on internal combustion engines, and that they can be reworked to be a better fit for electric vehicles and then also potentially autonomous vehicles as well. And maybe just one other point as well. I think to anyone who spent much time with the USMCA autos rules of origin knows that they are extremely complicated. And that's probably putting it lightly. So I think there might be a push here to try to streamline these rules of origin in some way through this review.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can just jump in briefly also, I kind of agree that some change needs to be made. Even the labor value content, this in principle, the $16 minimum wage, I don't really think that worked as intended or as desired by labor folks. That I think it became sort of a game. And the rules of origin, as Patrick mentioned, they're ridiculously complicated. And so really the companies are playing around to comply, but without really moving a lot of production. So if it can be simplified, if it can be modernized, if it can be streamlined to a place where it really accomplishes the goal at the end of the day. But we know, I mean, this is just having been in this world for a long time, that the company's goal is always to get a rule of origin that doesn't require them to change anything they're doing right now. And that's not exactly what a rule of origin is designed to do. It is designed to sometimes incentivize more production in the United States. But even to the extent, and I think this is an important piece that Patrick, you brought up also, that we think about the rule of origin as, how much it comes in the US versus Mexico and Canada, but also like how much is in North America versus outside of North America. And that, it came up a little bit in the TPP. Like, what does that even mean? That, to me, you actually want a pretty strong rule of origin to benefit the 3 North American countries, because we know that production is integrated across the 3 countries. And to the extent that our North American partners are agreeing to stronger labor standards, to investment rules, to IPR rules, to all the things that we put into our trade agreements, we should have more trust in saying that this can be beneficial, but only if people are really treating their workers right, treating the environment right, and doing what we expect from them. And this should benefit the signatories as opposed to other outside countries.
Fantastic. Well, the next question is, do you think companies are that concerned about the USMCA review, or rather, do they want more clarity to run the business?
I think companies are concerned, but they don't know enough content about what the administration is sort of specifically going to pursue. And so at this stage, I think it's about being engaged, at finding, meeting with folks in the administration, understanding what the conversation is and how it's evolving, and so that you're ready and you can tap into issues that come up and contribute in ways that make sense for the companies. I mean, I do think there is a strong desire for certainty, sort of regardless of where we are. And the the USMCA review process, because it has the public comment, because it has congressional reports and a process around it, it does lend itself to more transparency and airing about what we are going to be pursuing. And so that does create an opportunity for companies to participate and understand what the conversation is.
Just a word on the process, which is, we have, as Patrick laid out, opportunity for comment. There's the advisory committees. There will be hearings. So there are a lot of channels where input can be made. I think one of the things that might be unsettling for companies and for civil society around this administration is it's very hard to understand how the decision-making process works. Are even cabinet secretaries in the room when key decisions are made? And so, if you go through all of the input process and staff are diligently documenting and summarizing and putting that all together, and then a decision is made in a non-transparent way without the participation of key players, I think that's unsettling to everybody. And it also makes you feel like it's been a big waste of time. So that's what, certainly looking forward, hoping that this process can be both transparent and meaningful, that the stakeholder engagement is meant to really not just check the box and, be like the empty file where all the input goes in but nothing comes out, but really that we can see at the end of the day that the comments that were made and the stakeholder engagement led to incorporation of those ideas into the final agreement. So that's, I think, what people will be looking for.
I'm going to use my moderator's discretion on this next question, which is, do you foresee any changes to the environment chapter and the mechanisms under this chapter? Well, it was perfect. So no, I'm kidding. We spent a lot of time on the environment chapter. I think it had more provisions in that environment chapter than in many of the environment chapters combined prior to it. But that all being said, I mean, there's definitely, I think, some issues that I would keep an eye on. Would firstly say, a big shout out to the USTR team that's been working on these issues over the years, because they have been very diligent in both proactively looking for new environment issues to bring to the table and also enforcement. And so I think that's great. Under USMCA, I would really be interested to see, if there could be any new type of rapid response analog that could be used on the environment side, particularly for certain facilities or companies, so it's not just an across the board hit. I think that there's also a lot of cross-cutting issues that have come up in recent years. So for example, energy security. We used to sort of deal with that separately than, the environment chapter, but I think that there's enough in the, sort of how do you figure out, resiliency of things like critical minerals that you need for all sorts of energy sources. I'm going to say that I would like to see some more like cross-cutting work being done in some of those areas. WTO had a landmark fisheries subsidies deal that just went through. If Angela's still on, big congratulations to her and the WTO team and to everybody who worked on that. That was a huge new area in USMCA. So I think that there'll also be areas like that where there's going to be a stock taking. How has this worked? Was it, did it work as planned? And is there something more that we can add? Okay, so we have one last minute, so very rapid fire. Is there any investigation protocol to specify which products the US would request Canada and Mexico to increase tariffs on to move in lockstep with the US? Any final thoughts from any of our panelists on that question?
I mean, it's an interesting question of whether a process could be set up and kind of looking at, forward looking. Our supply chain concerns of today may not be our supply chain concerns of tomorrow. And so that's a great question. I think a question about, as we use 232 in these economic security, national security ways, would mirroring that, for example, be something, a request that could be made? that's something I'm sure that's being considered. But I think when we look at it today, I think we look at those sensitive sectors that across administrations, the supply chain has been looked at, critical minerals, semiconductors, and others that have been the subject of intense policy consideration, as well as the industrial sectors where we see China's overcapacity just swamping not only the United States, but the region and the rest of the world. So steel, aluminum, autos, others. And so, I think that's the way I think about it, that there's a today problem, but then will we have a mechanism for thinking about how to cooperate going forward?
We landed on time, Ken. So thank you to all of the panelists for answering all of the questions.
Thank you guys very much. Really, really appreciate it. Yes, Greta, there are today problems, but we are all working and finding a cooperative way to work on those. Thank you to this panel very much. Super informative, really helpful. I'm actually gonna have to re-listen to some of this myself because there's so much to unpack in this critical agreement. We will send the recordings around to our guests who are here with us and those who may have missed some of these sessions. This session was also a great table setter for our WITA's ongoing USMCA review series, which is sponsored by GM, the National Association of Manufacturers, and Autos Drive America, who all have big stakes in the USMCA. We hope this seminar was helpful to all of you in understanding the context of current U.S. and global trade landscape. We're going to continue driving the debate at WITA, have another big event coming up later this month with our first Tech and Trade Summit, or Trade and Tech Summit, I should say, and more events in our USMCA series, our 2026 International Trade Conference in February. And we hope you all tune into WITA's Friday Exchange podcast and video, which you can find on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. The Intensive Trade Seminar is an important linchpin in our work as a convener of the global trade community. And we're delighted you could join us this year. And we hope to see you either online or in person in the weeks and months to come. Thank you all for joining us.